It's October 1st, 2013, and a young man walks into a public library in San Francisco. He takes a seat, opens his laptop, and connects to the Wi Fi. Now, to anyone watching, it's just another guy checking his email. But to the feds, this isn't just anyone. This is the kingpin of the dark web, the mastermind behind Silk Road. And within seconds, they move in. Two undercover agents create a distraction, and a third lunges for the laptop, grabbing it before he can shut the lid. That one moment right there made the entire case because that laptop contained everything: passwords, chat logs, code, orders, Bitcoin wallets, and even a journal chronicling how a kid from Texas turned into the Dread Pirate Roberts, the kingpin behind the Silk Road. And what he built, well, let's put that into perspective. In just over 2 years, from 2011 to 2013, there were over $1.2 billion in drug transactions, millions of users buying everything from LSD to cyanide to human body parts like kidneys, bone marrow, livers, all that type of stuff. And Bitcoin was flowing like water in a time when people thought it was just a meme. 5 murder for hire plots, 2 life sentences, and no parole whatsoever. Ross Ulbricht was supposed to die in prison, but he didn't. Because just 4 months ago, as of making this, in January 2025, after 11 years behind bars, President Donald Trump pardoned him, full and unconditional. Now, you're probably asking yourself, how the hell did we get here? If you've been following this story, you probably know a lot about it. And if you're brand new to it, this sounds like an absolutely fictional story, but it's very, very true. And I know you've probably seen a dozen YouTube videos and podcasts on the Silk Road, but I can promise you, or at least I hope to keep this promise with you, that this isn't one of those. This is the full story behind it, from Ross's awkward beginnings to the rise of the most dangerous marketplace on the internet at its time, to dirty cops, fake murder, stolen Bitcoin, to the courtroom chaos, and finally, to his mother who never stopped fighting to bring her son home. So sit back, because this is the real story of Ross Ulbricht, of the Silk Road, and how one man's obsession with freedom changed the internet forever. Welcome back to Novel Wisdom, where I like to share the people, the stories, and the ideas that have helped change or shape history. And today we're covering the book American Kingpin by Nick Bilton. Now, this, as I mentioned, is about the Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht, about how a seemingly normal Texas kid went on to build one of the most insanely massive drug empires at the time under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts. And it documents everything from this episode. We'll be covering the story behind it, everything that went down from the creation of Silk Road, the actual chat logs that were used within it, the transformation of Ross into DPR. And DPR stands for Dread Pirate Roberts, so I'll just be using that just because it shortens it. And the unbelievable growth of Silk Road in literally just the span of a little short of 3 years, the dirty cops in it, the murder for hire, and so much more. But before we get into the story, I just want to say thank you so much for listening, and I hope that the story does it justice and you guys enjoy it. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of what I got from this story is from this book. It's an absolutely amazing book. Highly recommend you read it because it documents so much into it. And at the end of it, we'll kind of get into how much work and effort was put in the book by the author himself. But he does have a lot of really interesting things in here. Like I mentioned, the actual chat logs that was used by DPR, his associates, the dirty cops that were undercover, all that stuff. And there's some really interesting things, like when I talked about the murder for hire, you can actually see the actual chat logs of what DPR was telling people, how he wanted people killed, the picture evidence of it all. Like, there's so much in this book, there's so much to this story, and I think it's just a really interesting read. Whether you've never heard of the Silk Road or if you're familiar with it, I think this episode is going to cover a lot of things that I wasn't really able to find in other videos or podcasts or anything like that. So if you stick around for the whole thing, I hope I can do it justice. So let's get into it. Now, we're going to start with the early life of Ross, because I think to understand this entire thing, you need to understand who Ross Ulbricht was before the Silk Road. He was born March 27th, 1984 in Austin, Texas, and he grew up in a middle-class suburban household. It wasn't wealthy, but it was pretty stable. Now, his parents, Kirk and Lynn Albrecht. Now, Lynn will become very important later in the story, and she was a really huge proponent in getting him pardoned, which we'll talk about again in the end. Very supportive, educated, middle of the road type of people. So supportive that she actually stuck by her son's side, and so did his father afterwards. So kudos to his parents if they decide to listen to this or watch this. Now, Ross was known to be smart, and in the book it goes on to say, before he could utter the words mom and dad, it was instantly apparent to Lynn and her husband Kirk that there was something different about their son. At a young age, he knew answers to mathematic questions that his parents didn't even understand, and he often preferred to read about political theory, existentialism, and quantum mechanics. Now, Ross enjoyed science, nature, and the outdoors, and as the book likes to title, he liked to smoke a lot of weed. He was very calm, down to earth, and people would kind of describe him as like the golden boy. Growing up, he was very likable, gifted, curious, and extremely polite. Some people who met him thought he was overly altruistic of an attitude, which they thought was a bit of an act. And how can someone be that nice? And this was evident simply from the way he spoke, often sounding painfully folksy, using words like golly, geez, or heck. And if he had to swear, he'd use the words fudge instead of fuck. So when he went to high school, he attended Westlake High School, the same school as Drew Brees and Nick Foles. And aside from creating Super Bowl quarterbacks, it was also an academically competitive school as well. Now, he went on to study physics at the University of Dallas, Texas, and then he transferred to UT Austin, where he got his bachelor's in physics. After that, then he went on and he transferred to Penn State, where he got his master's degree in material science and engineering. So you can kind of already see from the get-go, like Ross is a pretty smart individual, but I think it's also important to know, and this is where a lot of the flaws come in when he's building Silk Road, he didn't really have a lot of computer science background. Everything was self-taught from forums, from people that he talked to on those forums, and he basically did everything himself. Now, again, very intelligent in that sense, but there were a lot of flaws which eventually led to his demise, which we will definitely cover. Now, another important thing to understand about Ross is when he was at Penn State, he joined the Penn State's College Libertarian group. They met once a week and studied libertarian philosophies, read books on economics and theory. And just in case you're not aware or you don't really understand what libertarian beliefs are, essentially they believe in maximum freedom and minimum government intervention. People should be free to live however they want as long as they don't harm other people. The free market rules everything, and the economy works best when the government doesn't interfere. It really holds true to personal responsibility, and it's very anti-intervention from the government. Kind of let people live the way they want to do, let them do what they want as long as they're not breaking any hard rules like murder, stealing, things like that. And this is pretty important because this is the belief system that really develops the idea of Silk Road. And just to give you a sense of his belief system, here's a speech that he gave from Penn State, which I got from the book. So here he is talking to a group of people, and they're having a debate over libertarian philosophies, and they're just debating a bunch of things. And Ross goes on to say, "It is not the government's right to tell people what they can and cannot put into their bodies." Ross began going on to explain that drugs should be legalized as it would make society safer, and people have a right to put what they want into their bodies. Now, the college Republican responded to his arguments. How can you legalize something that kills tens of thousands of people per year? And Ross commonly countered, so do you think we should outlaw Big Macs or McDonald's because too many people gain weight and have heart attacks and then die as a result of that? And should we outlaw cars because people get into car accidents and die? And so you could see here that mainly what he was trying to argue is that he has these libertarian beliefs, but he's also a very strong proponent on drugs. He wants to essentially legalize every single drug possible. And that's because he believes it's your body and you should be able to put what you want into it without the government saying weed is illegal and heroin's illegal and this and this and this. It should be a free market and people should have the right to choose what they do with their body and what they buy for it. Now, there are some interesting studies. I definitely should have cited this a little bit more, but if you look at Portugal, and obviously there's a little bit of cherry picking in this data as well, but if you look at Portugal, I think decriminalized every single drug in their country. Now, I might be mistaking that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. And if you look at a lot of the statistics from there, obviously crime rates fell because now everything's decriminalized. And instead of pushing to, find whether it was drug users or addicts as criminals, they sought and try to help them more on the mental side. Maybe they were a little sick, maybe they were addicts and they needed a little bit of help. And they completely switched the theory of like, these aren't criminals, these are just people that want to do what they want with drugs, or maybe they're addicts and they need help. And a lot of the statistics in Portugal, if you go look it up, have been extremely favorable in terms of decriminalizing almost every drug, creating safe havens if people want to do heroin. Um, I don't know if it's in Portugal, but I think in Germany they have like heroin parks or parks where you can essentially do drugs there in a safe manner. And it's just a lot safer for people when they don't have to hide and do it illegally. And, you know, so essentially, what happens to Ross is that he graduates from Penn State. And the problem with this is that he graduated with his master's from Penn State, which is very good, but this was around 2009. There weren't many options for him. And the book goes on to say, but what choice did he have? It wasn't like he could go out west to Silicon Valley and get a startup job. After the bubble had popped a few years earlier, companies that had been built on the wing and a prayer had siphoned people's retirements into thin air and collapsed, leaving San Francisco a metaphorical no-fly zone. Well, what about going east? Wasn't there opportunity on Wall Street for someone as clever as Ross? No way. The banks were collapsing from the housing market crash. And certainly he couldn't settle down and live happily ever after with his girlfriend. His dream of marriage and a white picket fence had been bulldozed by several other men. Now, in the book, it goes on to talk about that Ross was dating a female and, he actually was going to propose to her. He had the ring and everything. And when he asked her to marry him, she kind of told him that she was cheating on him with several men. And so now you have this Ross Ulbricht, who graduated with his master's degree from Penn State during one of the hardest recessions that we've ever seen, the 2009 recession. Couldn't go out west because that wasn't going to work. Going out east didn't make sense because nobody was hiring. And now his girlfriend for many years basically told him, as he asked to get engaged with her, that it's not going to work out because I've been cheating on you this whole time. And so, to put the cherry on top, he also failed his PhD exam where he was supposed to continue his education and studies in, quote, growth of EUO thin films by molecular beam epitaxy. Now, this was mainly because he was so focused on his new obsession, his libertarian ideas. And so he left Penn State without knowing what to do next, and he eventually moved back to Austin. And there was a moment where he was at a bonfire with his now new girlfriend, Julia, which he met at Penn State. She moved back out to Austin with him. And when they were at this bonfire with his friends, they were shooting the shit, drinking beer, smoking weed. And then the topic of work comes along, and they ask Ross, hey, Ross, man, what have you been doing all of a sudden? Well, what he didn't tell them, though, was that he had given up his day trading because it wasn't profitable. And the few times that he had made some money, he hated the inordinate regulations and taxes that Uncle Sam applied to investors. So day trading wasn't working for Ross. He also didn't tell him that he had failed his PhD exam or that he had despised renting his house out to college students because of all the inconsequential problems that had forced him to be dealt with as a landlord. And so, renting out his house and becoming a landlord also was a dead end for Ross. And he certainly didn't tell them that the gaming simulation that he had been building for months, which would simulate a seasteading project, had also failed, as no one wanted to purchase it. And seasteading, if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially like based on libertarian philosophy and thoughts where you can create a civilization out at sea because out at sea, there really are no governments that are in charge of the ocean. And so it would be like this place where you can really express all your libertarian philosophies instead of doing it in the real world because that would be really difficult. Ross thought he would try to make a video game out of it. That also fell through. And he also didn't mention all the odd jobs that he had done off Craigslist to make a few dollars, including editing science papers. And he didn't say that everything he had done had felt like a complete failure to him. One brilliant idea after another that no one else thought was brilliant. And so I give you a lot of this background because I think it's extremely important to, one, know who Ross Ulbricht was before the Silk Road, but also to document a lot of his failures because now you can kind of encompass and see a man who, one, is very brilliant, obviously very smart, but has just hit dead end after dead end. And he just feels like he doesn't know what he wants to do in life. He wants to do something big, something grand, but every pursuit that he looks at, every road that he decides to take either ends up in failure or just isn't even worth starting. And so what he does is he moves back to Austin with his new girlfriend, Julia, that he met at Penn State. And this time he's making a couple $100 here and there. And he actually has his own business called Good Wagon Books. It's where he takes, I think it's like old books, and he goes to try and resell them, kind of like an arbitrage opportunity. And anything that he doesn't make money on, he just kind of donates the books and gives them away, I think, to people that need them, or I don't remember how it describes it in the book. But as he was still thinking of new startup ideas, he was thinking of creating a website. And this is where someone could go onto this website and you could buy and sell anything imaginable, all while being anonymous. And because he had been talking to people on forums, he came across this guy named Arto, who told him about Tor. Now, there was a website called Tor, not really a website, but a way to get into the deeper parts of the web. And it enabled people to slip behind this curtain online into another essentially separate internet, the one where the US government couldn't track people because thanks to Tor, everyone became invisible. Now, if you're not familiar with Tor, maybe you are, I want to give you a little bit of a breakdown because I think it helps and it's definitely very essential to understand this side of it as we go deeper into the story. So obviously, before we go any further, you've probably heard of the term dark web. It's thrown around all over, especially in crime shows and conspiracy videos like this. But what is it really? Now, imagine the internet like an ocean. The internet you and I use every day, Google, YouTube, Instagram, that is the surface web. It's like the top of the ocean, visible and searchable. Search engines can easily find it and index these pages. But then you go down a little bit deeper, and that is the deep web. This is the stuff that's not indexed by search engines, but it's still legal and it's normal. You can think of it as like your private email box, your Netflix account, your bank login page. It's hidden, but it's not shady. And then as you get down to the deepest parts of it, you get into the dark web. This is the deepest part of the ocean, the pitch black trenches. You can't stumble into it by accident. You actually have to know how to get there. And you need a special key to get into. And that key is called Tor. Now, what does Tor stand for? And why is it called that? Well, Tor stands for the onion router. Why an onion? Because it has many layers to it, kind of like an onion. And when you use Tor, your internet traffic is wrapped up in multiple layers of encryption. It bounces through three randomly selected servers around the world. I don't know if it's exactly three, but for this reference, let's use it. And before it reaches its destination, each server peels off one layer of encryption, kind of like peeling an onion, but never knows the full picture. And so if the government or a nosy hacker is trying to track someone, all you see is a dead end. And this is how people stay anonymous online for the most part, unless you're like a really good hacker or you got the FBI on your tail. There's definitely a couple ways around it. But it's why hidden websites like Silk Road could exist for so long without really revealing where the server was or who was behind it. And here's the crazy part. Tor was actually invented by the United States Navy. It was designed in the 1990s by military researchers as a tool for anonymous intelligence gathering. They wanted spies and descendants to be able to browse the internet without getting caught by their hostile governments that maybe they were being spies for. And then, in a moment of irony, they actually released it to the public to strengthen the anonymity pool. Because if only spies used it, it was pretty obvious who was hiding on it. If only spies were able to use it and only knew about it, if a hacker got on there or one of the governments that they were working against saw them, it's pretty obvious who's using it. But if millions of people use it, journalists, activists, regular civilians like you and I, then it becomes much harder to trace. So, in a strange twist, a tool built by the government helped launch one of the greatest black markets the government has ever seen. But there's still one big problem. You can be anonymous on a website, but your money isn't. And the idea for this, obviously, black market drug website that Ross was trying to build was you can be anonymous, but if you use your credit card and your personal information, that just won't work. So around 2010 timeframe, Ross sits on this idea for a year because obviously this idea isn't going to work unless you can be completely anonymous. And he couldn't figure out the money part. And he sat on it for a year. And that is until 2009. Well, really 2010 when Ross figured it out, or essentially like 2010, 2011 timeframe when Ross heard about Bitcoin. So let's go down another rabbit hole because I think this is also a very important thing to understand. So now you know what the dark web is. It's a secret tunnel system hidden behind layers like an onion, where you can move around the internet without being seen or without anyone knowing who you really are. But again, there was still that huge problem, the money. You couldn't just use your Trace credit card to buy a brick or LSD without someone or everyone finding out who you were. And so, what Ross Ulbricht needed was a way for people to pay that was one, anonymous, two, untraceable, and three, outside of any government. And that's where this last puzzle piece falls into place. When Bitcoin was created, and I think 2009, I believe, was like the official date. And so, what is Bitcoin? I know you've probably heard of it because now it's basically everywhere. Everyone's already been talking about it, but I think it's good to break it down to a very simple level so you understand the importance of Bitcoin and the role it played in creating Silk Road and this entire story. So imagine if the internet had its own currency. No banks, no governments, no printing money out of thin air. That's Bitcoin, essentially. It was created in 2009 by a mysterious figure named Satoshi Nakamoto. And to this day, no one knows who he, she, or they are. There's a lot of speculation, and a lot of people believe that they might know who the real Satoshi Nakamoto is, but it's never actually been proven. It's a form of digital currency, but unlike Venmo or PayPal, it's not connected to your real name or identity, and it doesn't live in a bank, it lives on the blockchain. So, what is the blockchain? You can think of the blockchain as like this huge, giant public ledger. It's a notebook in the sky that records every Bitcoin transaction ever made. And here's the interesting twist, it's decentralized, meaning that nobody controls it. Not a company, not a government, not a single person or a group of people. And it is permanent. Once something is in the ledger, it cannot be changed. It's pseudo anonymous. So you're represented by a random strings of letters and numbers, not your name, like on your Chase credit card or whatever credit card that you use. And you can see that, let's say I sent 10 Bitcoin to you, you can see that transaction, but you don't know the two people between that transaction unless you know that specific account. And so now that we know a little bit about Bitcoin and a little bit about Tor, why was Bitcoin so important in the Silk Road? Well, Ross had the dark web for privacy. He had Tor for anonymity. But without Bitcoin, there was no way to move money through this black market. Cash doesn't work online. Wiring money gets you arrested. PayPal, you can forget about it. It's centralized and trackable. Bitcoin was that missing piece that didn't allow Ross to create the Silk Road for over a year until he found out about it. It allowed drug dealers and customers from all over the world to exchange money without ever meeting, without ever giving names, and without ever using a bank. It was like giving criminals an offshore account on the cloud, and then suddenly the Silk Road could function like the Amazon for drugs. And so in the summer of 2010, while Julia was photographing naked women, because that was her business, she was a boudier or boudaire. It's basically where you take pictures of like half naked women. She was taking pictures of half naked women, making them into calendars, and then selling them or allowing them to be bought by their husbands. And so, as his girlfriend was doing that in their apartment during the year of 2010, when Ross found out about Bitcoin, the missing piece to the Silk Road puzzle, the failed physicist who wanted so badly to make a difference in the world sat down at his beloved laptop to realize the idea that had been lodged in his mind for so long, a website that would be free and open marketplace where people from all over the planet could buy anything and everything. And it's important to note here, while Ross was very smart, he was not that computer smart. Again, like I told you, he learned everything about coding, programming, developing from forums, and speaking to others. Sure, he was self-taught and built it all by himself, but as a newbie, you're bound to make some mistakes and some very crucial security mistakes. Ross just didn't realize how big one of these mistakes would come back to haunt him. So, by February 2011, the Silk Road was officially alive. After about a year, the website was ready to launch. And it goes on to say in the book, by himself, he had essentially done the work of a 12-person startup, acting as the front-end programmer, back-end developer, database guy, Tor consultant, Bitcoin analyst, project manager, guerrilla marketing strategist, CEO, and lead investor, and not to mention the in-house fungi culturists. The in-house fungi culturist part, well, when Ross was building the site, he knew that he needed something to advertise. And he knew he couldn't really reach out to anonymous drug dealers and say, like, hey, you want to sell stuff on my website, even though you have no idea what it is. And so, in a moment of brilliance, he decided that he was actually going to start growing magic mushrooms. He rented out an old apartment out of Austin, Texas, for I think it was like $300 or $400 a month. This is how he got his first product on Silk Road. He was going to be the first one to advertise this, and his idea was he was going to make magic mushrooms and then he was going to test it. But there was actually one time when he almost got caught, and the story is really funny. So in his apartment in Austin, there was actually a leak in the apartment, and so the landlord gets called about it. He actually goes into the room because the leak was in Ross Ulbricht's room, the one that he was renting out. As the landlord walks in, he sees the entire thing because there was no furniture in there. Literally, the only thing that was in there was all of Ross Ulbricht's magic mushrooms that he was growing. And by a stroke of luck, he calls Ross Ulbricht first and he says, "I'm going to call the cops." I don't know why he didn't just call the cops right away, but obviously Ross Ulbricht starts freaking out. He goes over to the apartment, takes all of his drugs out, and then essentially just cuts the lease and just leaves. And so he's never caught, never questioned about it. And this is the first time that Ross has an out. Maybe this is too dangerous. I almost got caught for this. But no, Ross is too invested at this point. He's been working on the website for over a year. This is not going to slow him down. So now he has a site, he has the money problem figured out, and he has product, his magic mushrooms. But how do you advertise it? How do you find people for the site? Because it's not like you could just stumble across it. You actually have to know how to get to the site on Tor. You need the actual URL. It's like a string of letters and numbers dot onion. And so he went to forums. And you have to remember this part because this part becomes very, very important later in our story. Not to spoil anything. But at exactly 4:20 p.m. on Thursday, January 27th, Ross had gone to a website called The Shroomery, which was an online haven for all things related to magic mushrooms, and registered an account under the name Altoid. Now, you have to remember that to register this, you also have to use an email. Just remember that part. He then posted a comment on the site's forum under the Altoid pseudonym, writing that he had just stumbled across or come across this website called Silk Road, as if he had been out on a stroll in the dark web and accidentally stumbled out upon it. He then urged people to check it out. This, he hoped, was how people would find his new creation. He would then do this over and over again in other related forums. Bitcoin forums. There's actually one where he did a heroin forum, the Shroomery. He did this for all types of forums, and he created that pseudonym, used an email address, created the pseudonym Altoid, and then he just went on here and he's like, "Hey, look, I just stumbled across this thing called the Silk Road. You guys should probably check it out. It's really cool." Now, to Ross' surprise, these forums actually worked. I mean, there were now a couple hundred sellers and buyers from the site. And it was growing so fast that it actually caught the attention of a writer called Andrew Chen. He was the writer for Gawker. Now, basically, a site, it's no longer available. Ryan Holiday actually wrote a book on it, how it collapsed. It's called Conspiracy. Maybe I'll read that book on this podcast and talk about it a little bit more. But basically, it was a site known for exposing secrets, gossip. It was extremely controversial. So Andrew Chen thought that this site was fake. I mean, he saw people talking about it in forums, and he's like, there's no way that there's an online Amazon for drugs on the dark web. So he put out in the forums asking for interviews because he wanted to write an article about it. And so actually a ton of buyers responded to him. And one buyer actually said, quote, "It felt like I was in the future." And another buyer was talking about how it was actually much safer because I didn't have to go to my local dealer and get worried about either being mugged, shot, or killed when I could just buy the drugs online and have them shipped to my house or a P.O. box. And so, obviously, Ross's idea was working. He wanted to make, one, drugs legal, which he had through this website. Not legal, but, I mean, easier to buy. And anonymous, so you didn't have to worry about your Coke dealer stabbing you or taking your money because he just felt like it that day. And then he even got a response from the founder himself. Yes, Ross Ulbricht, obviously anonymous at this point. He was just talking about why he created it. He was telling him about his libertarian philosophies, why he wanted the site to exist, his thoughts on drugs, why they should be legalized, and all of this. And he spilled it all out to Andrew Chen. And obviously Andrew Chen's like, I don't know if this guy's actually the creator, but you know what? Let's roll with it. And then on 4:20 p.m., yes, the same exact time that Ross updated his forums, on 4:20 p.m., June 1st, 2011, Chen released the article into the world, and the article reads, the title read, "The underground website where you can buy any drug imaginable." The article began, "Making small talk with your pot dealer sucks. Buying cocaine can get you shot. But what if you could buy and sell drugs online like books or light bulbs? Now you can. Welcome to the Silk Road." What would happen next is something Ross would have never imagined happened so fast. Now, the article went absolutely viral almost immediately. There were now from hundreds to thousands of people buying and selling on the site. On top of that, Ross was starting to see thousands of dollars come his way. He was making exactly 6.23% on every sale on the site, all in Bitcoin. But what he didn't realize is that this attention also caught the eye of someone else because of how fast it was going up. It says, with the trepidation, he clicked to play a video in the article he was reading. There, in a small rectangular window, stood Senator Chuck Schumer at a press conference podium, a vexed look on his face. To the senator's right and left, two large, oversized printouts of the Silk Road website rested on display stands. Below him, on the wooden rostrum, a blue, white, and gold insignia of the U.S. Senate was clear for the press corps and Ross to see. Almost immediately from putting up the website, I think when it went live in February to June, it was essentially anonymous. Only people on forums knew about it. Literally weeks after this Gawker article, there were thousands of people who were talking about it, and it even caught the attention immediately of the Department of Justice and the DEA and Senator Chuck Schumer, who brought it up at one of these meetings. And they were made aware of this site. And remember, Ross had built this site from advice and self-taught skills, so there was obviously a ton of security issues. I mean, immediately, he was now being hunted by the Department of Justice, the DEA, and then a lot of hackers that were also trying to fuck him over. And there is actually a part in the book where his code was so bad that one of the hackers actually switched to where the Bitcoin was going. And so every sale, his 6.23% was now going to a completely different Bitcoin address. Like, he made so many mistakes because he literally just built this entire site by himself from what he read on forums and just self-taught skills. I mean, pretty impressive, but obviously a lot of flaws. A lot of these security issues would come back to haunt him. Now, it says Ross felt sick to his stomach. Over the past few days since the Gawker article had been published, an unremitting avalanche of press had followed in its wake. Ross's website had transformed from almost invisible to mainstream as it entered the national news cycle with shocking velocity. All the time, he was still living with his girlfriend, and she was the only one at the time that knew about this site. He openly brought it up to her, and he would talk to her a lot about it, and he's like, "Hey, babe, I have to tell you something. I've created the dark web, Silk Road, an anonymous page on the dark web where you can essentially buy any drug you want." And when then she saw that this news article and Senator Chuck Schumer and the Department of Justice were all after him, she urged him to stop the site before he got caught. But this is the first time where we see the second version of Ross that is born. No longer the very polite, humble, nice Ross. This is where you essentially see the first version of DPR, or Dread Pirate Roberts. But it's important to note he isn't born yet. On the site, he's known as admin, and that's just what he goes by now. But we'll get into that name in a little bit. And so after years and years of projects and failures, he was finally seeing something that was actually working. And he was making a lot of money from it. Remember, thousands of people were selling on the site and thousands of people were buying. And he was making on every single sale and purchase 6.23%. For him, it was time to double down. And at this time, there was only two people that knew. Like I said, Julia before, and then there was also a guy that was helping him code the site. But eventually, as he kept asking him these weird questions about the coding, the guy that he was talking to was like, "Look, I'm not going to help you with this coding process anymore until you actually tell me what you're doing." And so this is how the second person in Ross's life actually knew that this was the Silk Road and he was the actual creator. And so his girlfriend and a person helping him code the site were the only two people that knew. Well, during a night out, his girlfriend told one of her friends. So eventually, there's a third person that knew, but she only knew because of Julia. So it was kind of hard to really trust if what she was saying was real, because also at the same time, this is absolutely insane. And so there's actually a point in the book where eventually all three of them are parting. Her friend was in New York, so her friend flies from New York, comes over to Austin, Texas. They're partying, and at one point they get into an argument, Julia and her friend Erica. Ross eventually kicks her out, and he's like, you know what? Just get the fuck out of here. Go back to New York. We don't really want to party with you anymore. We don't want to deal with you anymore. And I think it's actually because she bought some LSD or acid off of Silk Road, and then she had a bad trip, and that's kind of how the argument started. Well, the next morning on his Facebook wall, Erica, Julia's friend, posts, I'm sure the authorities would like to know about Ross Ulbricht's drug website, she had written, like a giant neon billboard on the internet. Thankfully for Ross in the morning, he deletes it immediately. And he calls her and he's literally crying and he's apologizing to Erica and he's like, please, for the love of God, don't tell anybody about this site. And then this gets him into a huge argument with Julia because he's like, you completely destroyed my trust. I told you not to tell anybody else. He tells Erica. And at this point, he's extremely paranoid, but he's still very determined. And so he kind of had an ultimatum. He could drop the website, live with Julia, and find something else to do. Or option two, which is what Ross Ulbricht does, is he continues to work on the site, but he moves to Australia. He just wants to get out of the US just in case, the authorities come looking for him. And another reason he moved to Australia is because his sister lived there. And so this time frame when all of this broke down was around the end of 2011. Now, within a couple of weeks of moving to Australia, Ross was now pulling in tens of thousands of dollars a week in revenue. But with business booming, there was also escalated paranoia, the problems, and even more attention from the wrong people like cops and hackers. But during this time, Ross was still interacting with people on the Silk Road, like buyers, people that reached out to him, people who were like, hey, I really like what you're doing, and also people who wanted to work with him. And one of those people stuck out to him immediately. It was a guy by the name of Variety Jones. And the reason he reached out to him was actually really interesting. He actually reached out to Ross, well, really, Variety Jones, which we know him, that's his like pseudonym on Tor, reaches out to Admin, which is Ross. And he reached out to him because when he first heard of Silk Road after the Gawker article, he reaches out to him because he hacked the Silk Road. And it says he told Ross that a few months earlier, shortly after the Gawker internet article had been published, VJ and an associate had found a secret backdoor into the Silk Road servers. Late one night, like a couple of burglars breaking into someone's home just to look around, VJ had rummaged through the site's files to make sure that it wasn't being run by law enforcement. Hearing this obviously scared the shit out of Ross, and he thought to himself, who else might be sniffing around in here? But when VJ believed that the mastermind behind Silk Road was legitimately trying to end the war on drugs and wasn't an undercover DEA agent just trying to arrest poor, unsuspecting citizens, Variety Jones actually wanted to help the cause. After all, if the site grew, Variety Jones could make more money by selling more drugs because at this point, Variety Jones was using the Silk Road to sell weed seeds. And here he was, advice at the ready. Now, Variety Jones becomes an extremely important person in the story. He essentially becomes Ross's mentor, or what he knows him as Dread Pirate Roberts. But he also essentially, in the operations scheme of things, becomes number 2 in the entire Silk Road. So very important character here. And knowing that now, Ross knowing that he needed site security and knowing that obviously Variety Jones knew a little bit about that and having no one to talk to, they became really close. Like I said, VJ became number 2 on the Silk Road. And by the beginning of 2012, Silk Road was bringing in, this is crazy, within a year, over $500,000 per month in drug sales, all with little to no help from anyone else, but he did have Variety Jones. And then one night, Variety Jones and Ross were talking, and at this point, they were talking a lot. Like, they were literally so acquainted with each other that they would literally log off, and it's in the book, like, how they talk about, in the book, the chat logs are all there. They start logging off by, like, good night, have a good night, that type of stuff. And I think even one of them, at one point, like, kind of jokingly says, like, oh, I love you. Like, they got extremely close with each other. And Variety Jones said to him, because again, at this point, Ross is known as admin. That's all he's known as. And then VJ says to him that you need to change your name. And Ross called himself admin during this time. Now, the pressure that this put on Ross was monumental, but his new best friend had a plan that was somehow rooted in discussion about the movie Princess Bride. Ross replied to VJ's query about the film with this sort of yes, like many kids of his generation, his parents owned a copy of the movie on VHS. So, Variety Jones wrote, you know the history of Dread Pirate Roberts. Ross couldn't quite recall, but he began typing what he remembered about the movie and the name of the main character. When he was lost, Variety Jones finished the summary for him. Something about a guy called Wesley who took on the name Dread Pirate Roberts from someone else. And over the years, a new person would take on that name, and the old one would retire. So no one knew who the original Pirate Roberts really was. Yep, Ross replied, that's it. That was the movie. And then here it was. You need to change your name from admin to Dread Pirate Roberts, VJ wrote. And this is where in the early 2012 era, or 2012, like that's the time frame that we're in, this was the birth of DPR, which again, I'll just call him DPR from now on, and a second Ross Albrecht. Now we're going to start to see the blurred lines of Ross Ulbricht in real life and DPR, the drug kingpin online for the Silk Road. And you're going to see as the story unfolds the blurring of how they eventually become one person and DPR becomes Ross Ulbricht. And in the book, it goes on to say, as Ross, he could still think about his ideas about legalizing drugs, libertarianism, and his work with Bitcoin, all without getting anywhere near the Silk Road in his mind. And more important, never feeling like he was fibbing on the ones he loved. And once the Dread Pirate Roberts mask was slipped on, a different person could steer the ship into uncharted and potentially unethical waters. DPR could cross lines that Ross would never have come up against, all of which he would have to negotiate to take on the site to the next level. Oh, Captain, my Captain. As the Dread Pirate Roberts, Ross didn't have to constantly lie anymore, except to himself. Now, up to this point in the story, we've only talked about Ross and Variety Jones, and you kind of know the background about them and everything about them. But there is an entire different world to this entire story. It's the law enforcement side of it all, which is extremely important, obviously, because Ross Ulbricht is God. So I think it's important to introduce these characters and give you a little bit of context behind them. Now, the first one that I want to talk about is Jared Derjagan. He was actually a Homeland Security Investigations Special Agent based in Chicago. While monitoring suspicious international packages in 2011, he actually noticed a pattern of small drug shipments, especially ecstasy, MDMA, ecstasy pills, stuff like that, being mailed across the U.S., specifically from other countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, and a couple other countries. And then finally, he collected one of the suspicious packages that he kept seeing at customs. And so then, eventually, him and his supervisor went to the address where it was supposed to be shipped. They ended up talking to the roommate of the guy who bought the drugs because the guy wasn't there, but his roommate was like, oh, yeah, no, I'll talk to you. Like, he always buys drugs from this place. And so the roommate explains to him, literally openly, like, these are two special agents, and they're asking him, where does your roommate buy all these drugs? And he's like, oh, Silk Road. And they're like, oh, okay. They're kind of like taken aback that, like, how open he is. He's like, yeah, he buys these drugs on an anonymous site called the Silk Road. And he explains it as it's basically the Amazon for drugs. Now, Jared Derjagan has never heard of it. But his supervisor is like, yeah, everyone's heard of it. Like, there's 100 open case files on it. Like, how have you not heard of it? And so, curious, after this interaction, he goes back to his database and he looks at it. And instead of hundreds of open cases on the Silk Road, there are zero. There are no open cases on the Silk Road. And so eventually, Jared Derjagan is like the first person that really takes the initiative to crack the case open. And so he actually gets obsessed with the site and tries to find out everything that he can. Now, it's important to note that Jared Derjagan started out as a TSA agent. He tried to apply for the FBI. He didn't have a degree, so he didn't get in. He tried to go DEA. He tried to go a couple other alphabet soup agencies, but he failed a polygraph, didn't get along in the interviews. There's just a lot of stuff that he can do. And so he becomes a TSA agent. And he just wants to do a little bit more than TSA agent. And so one guy, I think a supervisor, tasks him with finding khat, Khat. Now, khat, as they explained in the book, is basically like one of the lowest level drugs that you can buy. Like if you find someone with khat, they will probably just let you go. Like it's really not that bad of a drug. And so what they do is, you know what, Jared, you want to do some stuff, go find some khat, go be useful. Like just get out of your hair. We'll give you something to do. And so what he does is he gets obsessed with finding khat. And this is kind of where the brilliance of Jared comes in and why he's so important to the case. Well, he created like this entire system of how he could find people using khat and tracking them and making sure that they caught them at the airport that he worked at. And so his first clue was that all the smugglers had booked reservations on the day before a flight. Second, the couriers used only Gmail or Yahoo email accounts. And the third, they had obviously fake phone numbers that used a shared formula. Now, with these hints and others, he searched through the list of incoming passengers arriving at O'Hare who fit this profile. Eventually, he actually identified an inbound passenger who believed would be smuggling the drug. The following day, customs officials pulled that man off an incoming flight, opened his suitcase, and discovered it was lined with khat. Holy shit, it worked. Now, the same thing happened after subsequent time. Jared ran his search on the incoming Chicago passenger database. They pulled caught out of the bag, and this kept working and working and working until eventually Jared's profiling worked so well that he started to search the national database, experimenting with this theory on other U.S. airports. And sure enough, it worked every time like magic. Customs officials at JFK would be told about a target, at which point they would open the suitcase of the passenger Jared had identified and subsequently find bags of the drug hidden in socks, shirts, and other crevices of the luggage. He eventually got so good at finding it that he eventually got promoted to where he is now. What did I say? The Department of Homeland Security Special Agent. And so, the same way that he tracked down his khat, he would use the same method for Silk Road on his own time, though. And so eventually what he had to do was that he had to compile enough evidence to bring to his supervisor, and he would bring it to his supervisor. And the way it worked, it's really interesting. You had to get assigned a case to officially work on it during your work hours. And so he still needed to convince his boss to assign him the case. And basically, you're like a salesman. You have to sell your case to your higher ups. And that's kind of how the author explains it in the book. And so basically, he builds this compelling evidence, he makes the case, and he talks about this is just more than drugs. Right now, they're just selling drugs on the Silk Road, but eventually they're going to be selling guns, maybe they're going to be selling bombs, and this is going to turn into like a terrorism pit where they're just going to be ordering illegal guns, bombs, and they're going to be able to do a lot of terrorist acts on this because everyone's anonymous and you don't know where a lot of this stuff is going. So he actually gets assigned the case. And as part of his case, it's funny, he's actually assigned $1,001 for a shopping spree. He is given $1,000 to just go haywire and order as many drugs as he wants or as he can on the Silk Road. And with this, he actually had three goals in mind. The first was to trace drugs back to their dealers. The second was to match listings on the website to the actual physical drugs and packaging. So he would get the drug, he would see what it looked like, and then he would match that to who he bought it off. So then he can kind of track the dealers that way, enabling him to build a profile of what mail the Silk Road looked like, as he had done with the cop back at Customs and Border Protection. And finally, Jared wanted to perform a small but very important task. He knew that the postal workers at ports across the United States were finding drugs in the mail system, but, and this was a big but, no one had any idea what percentage of drugs were not being found, how many pills and bags of powder were just swimming past officials. As far as Jared knew, the Silk Road could be a site peddling a few $1,000s a year of narcotics, or it could be vending tens of millions of dollars in illegal contraband a month, which it was. Nobody knew which it was, but Jared had a hunch he could figure it out. And so what he did with his $1,000 is he went on and he bought 18 different packages from 18 different dealers. One was confiscated, one was lost, and 16 others were sent to his personal P.O. box without anyone ever knowing, without it ever being flagged. Obviously, this is a pretty big problem because out of the 18 packages, only one was confiscated. Obviously, the other one was lost, but the other 16 made it through. Quite alarming for Mr. Jared Daryagan. Now, the second agent that gets wind is this guy named Carl Force, and he is a special agent out in Baltimore with the DEA. At the time when he heard about this case, he was a solar agent. They call him a solar agent because he only works when the sun is out. And he used to go undercover and do crazy things, do crazy busts like you would see in the movies. But eventually he got burned out and almost fired for a DUI. So he got put as essentially a desk jockey because he was spiraling out of control. And the book goes on to say His downward trajectory was compounded by the fact that he'd secretly developed his own substance abuse problem. From going undercover, when you go undercover, you can't just act the part, you actually have to be the criminal. And so that means you have to drink with them, you have to do drugs with them, you have to gain their trust. And finally, all the strain had been too much, and Carl was eventually arrested for a DUI while he was an agent, which led him to a mental breakdown 4 years later. He almost lost it all: the family, the job, the cats. But the Lord had stepped in, and Carl had been offered amnesty with this desk job as a solar agent. Since then, there hadn't been many opportunities arriving at his cubicle. But then that was all going to change in late January of 2012. His supervisor went up to him and asked if he wanted to join a case to find out who was running the Silk Road. Now, at first, when Carl agreed to join, he didn't really think much of it. But after doing some research, he became essentially obsessed with it the same way that Jared Derjagan was. With his undercover experience, he would go back undercover after years of being a solar agent. And this really sparked it for him because he loved the undercover work, but obviously going undercover in real life, it took a toll on him. But now he could go undercover online, and so he can kind of get the best of both worlds. He didn't have to go back into that world in the real life, but he could act it online. And so that is where Knob is created, the pseudonym or the anonymous name for Carl Force on the DEA. The DEA was like, okay, we'll let you go undercover and we'll run this operation through the DEA Baltimore office. And says, but on Silk Road, people wouldn't use their real name, even if it was fake. So in the same way that the leader of the site called himself Dread Pirate Roberts, Carl would need to create a moniker for his made-up persona. Again, he decided to pick a name for something else he knew well: the Bible. Call it a gut feeling, years on the job, overconfidence, but he wanted a nickname that chose to illustrate what was going to happen as a result of his work on the Silk Road. And so he chose a name from the Bible of a city that was destroyed by a king, the town of Nob. So Carl Force would become Eladio Guzman, a Dominican drug smuggler who would go by the online nickname of Nob. He went home, this is hilarious, and told his 12-year-old daughter that he needed her help. He grabbed a piece of white paper and with black marker aggressively scribbled "All Hail Nob." And then he placed an eye patch over his fake blind eye, pulled a dark hoodie over his bald head, and held up a piece of paper as his daughter snapped a picture for him. And so while Jared, the HSI agent, was trying to figure out how to get into the Silk Road by busting little dealers, trying to get information to them to work his way up the chain, Nob was going to go for a home run. He emailed DPR, Dread Pirate Roberts, directly asking to buy the site from him. Literally sent him an email as Nob through the dark web and was like, look, I'm this massive drug smuggler, I'm Nob, blah, blah, blah. I'd like to buy your site from you. And his supervisor was furious. It was one of the many times that Carl would bend the rules, because what they wanted to do was follow the same thing that Jared did. They would buy drugs, bust the little dealers, work their way up the ladder. But to Carl, or to Nob, he was like, nope, we're going to go for the home run. We're going straight for the guy. And so, crazy enough, Carl Force, or Nob, actually gets a reply. Ross actually replies to Carl Nob through the email that he put. They eventually go back and forth. Dread Pirate Roberts, DPR, is like, no, I'm not going to sell you the site. And even if I was, I would only sell it to you for 9 figures. Now, until now, everyone on the Baltimore task force and those inside the DEA had assumed the site was a relatively small operation, but his valuation seemed extraordinarily high. DEA agents had imagined that the site would be worth maybe a few million. At the highest, maybe, just maybe, Carl believed it would be worth 25 million tops. But 9 figures? That could range from anywhere to 100 million to 999 million. And a big reason for this, too, was because now the Silk Road wasn't only selling drugs, they had just opened up the armory. And with sales continuing to grow on the drug side, Ross was about to make even more money by adding guns. And this came from Ross's belief as a libertarian. He wanted a truly free marketplace. And it goes on to say in the book, because of his unflinching acceptance, there were no more than 2,000 different types of drugs for sale on the site, as well as lab supplies to make your own drugs and products to store and sell those drugs. There were digital goods, including keyloggers, spy software, and other similar tools to hack into someone's email or webcam. People could buy forged documents, including passports, fake IDs, and even counterfeit cash that was indistinguishable from real money. And then there was the most contentious section of the site labeled weapons, which had grown so much that you could buy everything from handguns to AR-15 automatic weapons. You could pick up bullets, grenades, and even a rocket launcher if need be. But if Ross wanted to keep growing his flourishing business, he needed to appease the most conventional customers, libertarian or not. Guns will scare off a lot of mainstream clients, Variety Jones had told him. So Ross was going to have to make some changes. If he really wanted to make drugs legal, which was his ultimate quest in creating the Silk Road, he was going to have to solve the gun issue. While he wouldn't bar them, or bar anything, essentially, as you'll see, he instead decided to create a gun-only website. Like, it's only, you have the entire Silk Road where you can buy your drugs, your spyware, basically everything, but he kind of wanted to section off the gun aspect of it, so he kind of created like another little site that was branded under the Silk Road. And when he explored the idea with VJ, they had come together to come up with the name The Armory. At first, it was going to be called the Silk Armory, sticking with the Silk Road branding, but they both decided it sounded too bizarre. Or as VJ pointed out, Silk Armory sounds like they sell Hello Kitty AK-47s. And so opening up the armory not only brought more press, but now the ATF was involved. Threats of terrorism, like Jared Derjagan talked about earlier, was becoming even more real. And now you have to remember, he was still making 6.23% on all of his sales at this point. There is a time, I think it's in the script somewhere, but there is a time when he actually changes the commission structure. And so basically it was a flat fee of 6.23%. And then what he eventually did was, if you sell higher volumes of stuff or you sell more money, the commission rate would be lower, so they don't get taxed as much, or the commission rate. And then if you sold, let's say, like $50 or $100 stuff, your commission rate would actually go up to kind of level out the playing field. And this brought mutiny across. Like, people were pissed about it. And so eventually, this almost brought down the Silk Road, because there was an onslaught of hackers trying to break into it, trying to take control, revert the commission rates, all this type of stuff. But with Variety Jones and a couple people that he employed, obviously they couldn't continue to keep the Silk Road running. Now, during this whole time, Ross was still living in Australia. Most of the time, he was really traveling around Asia. He was going to places like Thailand, Singapore, places like that. He was basically living like the digital nomad life. And so most of the time, he became very paranoid, because the only places he could get actual good Wi-Fi was at local places. And so as he would sit in these local cafes working on the Silk Road, he would always be looking over his shoulder, wondering who's watching him, wondering who's monitoring the Wi-Fi, all that type of stuff. And so he actually became very paranoid, because he did not want to go to jail in Thailand. Because if you got caught basically selling drugs in Thailand, and especially at the statute that Ross was, and now that it was an international crime, he would essentially just get put to death immediately. And so with this paranoia, he actually decides to move back to the US, and he moves back to San Francisco, where he ended up living with his friend and girlfriend at first. He would eventually go to local cafes all over the place, and one that he frequented, which is very important to the story, was especially close to his apartment, called Momi and Toby's. Now, he was surrounded by people who were trying to change the world. This was the Silicon Valley after the Great Recession. This was like the modern era to build your unicorn startups and everything. And so he was around these people that were doing exactly what he was doing, just in legal terms, right? Now, during this time frame, the FBI had just taken down LulzSec, one of the most notorious hacker groups on the planet at the time. Massive cyber crimes, high-profile attacks. It was a big deal. There was actually a point, I don't know if you could find it on the website, but I found this out from listening to Lex Friedman's podcast with the guy who actually was given the attention or the praise of taking down the Silk Road, Chris Tarbell. It's a really good podcast. You should definitely listen to it. But he talks about how they had a thing called Fuck FBI Fridays, Triple F. And every Friday they would essentially release very sensitive documents from the FBI or things that they were working on, just to kind of fuck with them. And the guy leading the charge, again, Chris Tarbell, was this 31-year-old guy, built like a tank, master's in computer science, and could apparently bench 450 pounds, according to what the book says. I mean, this guy was relentless. And he didn't just catch hackers, he actually turned them. Their ringleader in LulzSec was a guy named Sabu. He flipped him and used him to dismantle literally the entire crew. I mean, the media even started calling Tarbell the Elliot Ness of cyberspace. I mean, the dude definitely had a reputation, especially after taking down LulzSec. So after months of 20-hour days, Tarbell and his team are finally celebrating at one of the bars that they frequent. And they were drinking champagne, which in the book they talk about is just beer. They're in suits, high fives. It's that kind of vibe. And one of the guys at the table, Tom, turns to Tarbell and says, "So, what's next?" And Tarbell looks at him kind of annoyed. And he's like, "Really, man? Like, can't we just enjoy this moment for a little bit?" But Tom pushes again. He said, "There's this target that no one's been able to crack. The DEA, the HSI, even some foreign agencies have tried and failed. I think we should now look into the Silk Road." And just like that, the next phase of the hunt begins. Not right now while they're at the bar, they start looking for Silk Road. Even the FBI essentially has to hire or kind of like sell their case to their higher ups and basically say, "We want to work on this case." And because it was mainly drugs at this point, obviously there were guns and some other stuff. They mainly saw it as a drug site. And so they were like, "We're just going to keep it for the DEA at this point." So they don't get involved immediately, but it is on their radar. And at this point, Ross doesn't know it. He knows basically everybody's up against him: the Department of Justice, DEA, Department of Homeland Security, the ATF, things like that. But at this point, he didn't know that the FBI now was going to get involved. And he didn't just realize how fucked he would be getting. And again, at this point, Ross had built something massive. The Silk Road wasn't just a sketchy website anymore. It was a full-blown global drug empire. And he was sitting under the throne under the names DPR, Dread Pirate Roberts. But the bigger problem to the kingdom, the more paranoid, but the bigger the kingdom, the more paranoid the king had become. And that's where Variety Jones, or VJ, comes back in. Now, Variety Jones wasn't just some coder. He was essentially Ross's mentor. He was kind of like his dark web Yoda, if you want to think of it like that. And one day, Ross sends him a message. He said, "I wanted to raise a topic that we haven't discussed before." And even VJ was surprised. I mean, I can't imagine there's a topic that we haven't discussed before. Because again, they got extremely close. Like Ross was even, according to the chat logs, giving Variety Jones basically his entire life story without ever saying like, "Hey, I'm Ross Albrecht." But he basically told him that he lived in Texas. He told him about his mom and dad. He told him about fishing trips he would go with his dad. Like he really opened up to Variety Jones, and Variety Jones did the same to him. But he said there was one big problem: local security. Ross had finally realized that if the Fed showed up, there was no backup plan, no escape hatch, no failsafe. He hadn't thought about it that far. And so VJ starts laying it out for him. Because Variety Jones, when he was sharing information with DPR, he also told him that he's actually been to jail before, that he was also very involved in the drug business, and he understood a lot of the things. And he basically said, now that you're running the Silk Road and you're basically wanted by every single agency around the world, you have to start thinking like a fugitive. And so he then instructs DPR to install a kill switch on your laptop, basically a button you can hit, and it just shuts it all down, encrypts everything. And then he said to set up auto lock if you're idle. If you're idle for more than 3 minutes, your computer shuts down and then it encrypts. And then he said you basically have to separate your identities completely. Never check your Gmail on the same machine you use for Silk Road. Never blur those lines. Ross, to his credit, took this actually very seriously. He split his digital life into two: Ross on one side, DPR on the other. No crossover, ever. And then it got more intense, because Ross began demanding his employees to send them their real IDs. Now, Variety Jones was one of his main employees, but he also employed people that he met through forums and met through Silk Road, and he actually employed them to do like little security stuff here, to be admins, essentially like customer service and stuff. And so he goes to him and he's like, "I need your real IDs. I need to know if I can trust you." And the crazy thing about all this is they actually sent him the actual photos of their IDs and passports. And obviously this is known because when everyone gets busted, they're able to find these people extremely quickly because they just go off the idea that was sent from DPR in these chats, and they find them immediately. And so that's what they did, which is kind of wild to think about, but it shows you the power that DPR had over these people who worked for him. Essentially, he wasn't just a boss, he was building a cult of trust inside his anonymous criminal enterprise. And so this was the beginning of the transformation. Ross wasn't just running a website anymore. He was running an organization with hierarchy, protocols, and a bunker mentality at this point. And now he was starting to realize that if you want to stay free, you better start thinking like a fugitive. So here's where things get a little weird. Now, the DEA agent had joined the task force to take down the Silk Road. It was called Marco Polo Task Force, and that was the DEA agency that Carl Force worked for over in Baltimore. They had agents from everywhere, the DEA, Postal Service, and even the Secret Service. And the goal was to be the first team to crack who Silk Road was, or who was in charge of it. Obviously, Carl Force, a DEA agent out of Baltimore, was put in charge of going undercover on the drug side of things, and he created the undercover persona Knob and started chatting directly with DPR, as we know. But here's the problem. It's not that it wasn't working, it's that it was working too well. Carl was actually getting so much information, the same type of information that he was sharing with Variety Jones. And the weird thing is, it actually seemed like Carl started to like him. At first, he was just playing the role of Knob, who was supposed to earn DPR's trust, but somewhere along the way, the lines between Carl and Knob, in the same way that Ross and DPR, those lines started to blur. And he actually began greeting DPR like a friend. Literally from the chat logs in the book, this is how he started to greet him. Hello, my friend. You would end with stay safe, sleep good. And he even dropped a, you are the most interesting man in the world. Stay thirsty, my friend. And I kid you not, one day he ended the message with, love, Knob. So obviously he knew that Dread Pirate Roberts, he needed to gain his trust, and so he would kind of talk to him this way. But when he would talk to him, it really seemed like he was connecting with him. And there was a lot of times when his supervisor would look at these chat logs, because not only was he greeting him and talking to him about things, but he was also essentially supervising him on ways to essentially avoid the DEA, avoid getting caught. What are some backup plans that you have? Like, not only was Knob trying to get close to him, but again, he was blurring the lines of Carl and Knob and was kind of acting as like his second mentor, like Variety Jones was. And so, obviously, DPR, who by the way was probably starved for a real connection at this point, didn't even push back. He just replied, "You're making me blush." Like this is literally from the chat logs, like how they talked back and forth to each other. And so this isn't your typical undercover op. Carl wasn't just playing a role anymore. He was actually getting emotionally tangled. Maybe it was the adrenaline side of things. Maybe it was the ego. Maybe it was the loneliness on both sides. But whatever it was unprofessional and it was dangerous. Carl even started, like I said, giving DPR advice on how to stay hidden, telling him that he needed to move to another country and accept some of the things that if he did get caught, what he would have to do. And eventually his boss from the DEA, Nick, started reading the transcripts because everything that was talked about between DPR and Knob had to go into like this huge data file, and it was reviewed, and obviously his supervisor was able to see it. And this made him extremely furious. Like, this is not how you run a sting. But because instead of closing in on the target, Carl Force, the guy in charge of busting drug lords, was out here emotionally bonding with one. And so up to this point, DPR and Silk Road and Variety Jones have built this massive drug empire. Not only drugs anymore, but now you're able to buy spy software, weapons, and then this is where things get pretty dark. By now, it had grown into a full-blown marketplace. Again, drugs, fake IDs, hacking tools, anything you want that wasn't directly in confrontation with violence, right? It was pretty much fair game. Like, you couldn't order a hit on anybody. But then one day, Ross, or Dread Pirate Roberts, I should say, gets a message from one of his employees, and he's like, "Hey, someone wants to sell kidneys on the site. Do we allow that? Not drugs, not counterfeit bills, but literal human organs, kidneys, livers, and literal bone marrow." And Ross replies, calm as ever, "Is it listed or someone wants to sell?" So they forward him the email, and the person is offering kidneys, liver, and bone marrow, the whole human catalog. And you've got to understand, on the black market, this stuff is insanely valuable. I did a little bit of research, and it talks about it in the book as well. On the black market, at least around the time of like 2012 when this was all going down, a kidney can sell for as high as $260,000. A liver would sell for around 150,000, and bone marrow would go up to $23,000 a gram. Cocaine was just a couple $100, but bone marrow was $23,000 a gram. And you have to remember, on Ross's side of things, he was making a commission from all sales. hell yeah. Like, we are going to allow the sale of human organs because this is a huge cash cow now. Most people would stop there, but Ross, really mainly DPR, he leans into his libertarian theory and he says in his chat log, yes, if the source consents, then it's okay. Morals are easy when you understand the non-aggression principle. In his view, in DPR's view, it was a free market. No one was being forced to sell these drugs. And if they weren't taking it by force, like they would in Hostels, if you've ever seen the movie Hostel, totally weird movie, but you kind of get it. If you know, you know. No one was being forced. If someone wanted to sell their kidney, that was their right. And if someone needed to buy a kidney and was willing to pay, why should the government or the Silk Road say no? And so they started selling human body parts, or not parts, but like organs. And then came the poisons. And people started selling things like cyanide, clearly meant for assassinations and suicide kits, where just a couple weeks ago, DPR was like, hey, as long as it's not in direct correlation with aggression or violence, then we're totally good. And then he gets the email forwarded to him about cyanide and stuff like that, which is obviously meant to kill people or help assist in suicide. And again, DPR, as you see him evolve, doesn't flinch. He just justifies it by comparing the Silk Road to Twitter. And he literally says in the chat box, look, Twitter doesn't control what people post in their little 140 character box, right? We're just a platform. People do what they want. So this was kind of his mental gymnastics of basically saying that he's not going to do something at one point, but then he's kind of like, you know what? These libertarian philosophies, it is a free market, right? We're not forcing anybody. We're just a platform. We're totally good. And so this is eventually how he evolves and how he starts to accept all these things happening. He wasn't just running a black market, he was running a libertarian utopia, a place where choice was the only law and morality was just another personal preference. But in the process, the lines between Ross Ulbricht, the idealist, and DPR, the dark web kingpin, were starting to disappear. So even though Carl Force was getting a little, let's say, too cozy with DPR, he was technically still doing his job, at least for now. Early on, when Carl was still under his undercover identity Knob, when he first messaged DPR, he pitched a wild idea. He said, hey, I've got a ton of cocaine that I need to sell. Do you know anyone that can move it for me? And DPR, always eager to grow his network and his income, said, yeah, I can connect you with a guy. And he connected Knob with one of his employees, Curtis Green. Obviously, he didn't give him the real name, of course, just a username with Curtis. And then Curtis didn't give him a fake address. Like he gave DPR his real identity, he also gave this DE agent, Knob, his actual address, which was in Spanish for Utah. And Curtis would act as a middleman for this thing. And basically, when Knob emailed to buy the site at first, DPR was like, nope, not going to sell it, 9 figures. And they're like, okay, so this isn't going to work. But he's like, maybe we can set up a sting operation. And so obviously it's Eladio Guzman, the drug smuggler from, what was it, like the Dominican Republic or something. He then is like, hey, I can move like 50 tons, not 50 tons, like 50 kilos of cocaine. How about we just do 1 kilo, see how it works. If your middleman's good, we'll continue with that. And so the sting was on. Carl and the task force sent a brick of coke to Curtis's house. Yes, his real house, right? These weren't really bright people. And so they sat outside the van waiting outside of Curtis's home. And when the package arrived, Curtis casually walked outside, looked around a little bit nervously, and chucked the kilo of coke in the trash. Everyone in the van was stunned. Even Carl was like, what the fuck? And you can't arrest a guy for throwing coke away. And so they thought the op was completely over. Until a few hours, they continue to monitor and continue to watch him. Curtis comes back out, looks around nervously, and retrieves the package from the trash. Boom, game on. So they eventually storm in and arrest Curtis Green. Turns out Curtis Green wasn't just some random dealer. He was actually a Silk Road insider, an admin with special access like the ability to reset passwords, lock people out of their accounts, and he was more valuable than they actually thought. But here's where things get really off the rails. While Curtis was in custody as people were scouring through his house, they were arresting him, they were questioning him, looking through all his stuff, Sean Bridges, a Secret Service agent on the task force, is left alone with his laptop, still logged in as the admin, so he has full access to Curtis's thing. Instead of logging the evidence, Sean actually starts stealing the Bitcoin. He uses Curtis's admin credentials to siphon off $350,000 of Bitcoin, draining users' accounts on the Silk Road, and then quietly moves it into his own wallet. Nobody knew about this except for Sean Bridges, who was a Secret Service agent at the time. Not the DEA, not DPR, not even Curtis Green knew about this. And so when DPR logs in and sees hundreds of thousands of dollars missing, he thinks Curtis Green stole it. And by this point, since the start of Silk Road, we've seen that Ross has slowly evolved more into DPR. And at the same time, his beliefs and ways of handling things have also become a little less moralistic. Right now that someone stole money from Dread Pirate Roberts for the first time, for most of the time it was people hacking in, he'd have to pay them off. There were a lot of times when he talked about in the book, he would literally pay hackers like $50,000 a week in Bitcoin, just so they wouldn't hack the site. But now, for the first time, someone had just stolen from DPR. Someone had just stolen from the cartel. And now that someone stole from DPR, it was time for him to choose what to do next. And so, after Curtis Green gets arrested in that sting with a kilo of coke, you'd think that'd be it for him, right? He's done, game over, jail time, end of story. But no, the feds actually let him go because he's such a valuable asset and he has so much on the Silk Road and he has, high admin user. So they send him back to Utah, have someone monitor him. Why? Because he's useful. And they want to flip him, squeeze him for info, and maybe use him as bait to draw out DPR. And so Curtis is back home and the plan is to interrogate him a little bit more. But then something unexpected happens. DPR actually finds out about the arrest of Curtis Green, and because Knob and DPR are pretty close, like he was with Variety Jones, he tells Knob about this. And he also tells Knob about this because he knows that Knob sent Curtis Green the kilo, not thinking that it was a sting operation. He says, I think I should let you know because the kilo that you sent, well, yeah, that guy's busted and he got arrested. And so he somehow knows that his guy got popped and he's furious. And so he messages Knob, remember, it's still Carl Force on the DEA, and says, quote, "One of my employees stole from me. Not a ton of money, but it pisses me off." And at this point, no one knows that Sean Bridges, the Secret Service agent, had actually stolen the $350,000 in Bitcoin using Curtis's login. So everyone, even Carl Force, assumes that the thief is still Curtis Green. Even Carl believes it. And so DPR sends Knob Curtis's real ID. Again, this is how they find out that his admin, the people that worked for him, actually sent them real IDs, because at this point, Knob or Carl Force knew that this was Curtis Green. They knew it. And then DPR in an email or in their little chat box sends him the ID, and it's like, this is Curtis Green. Like, he actually sent you his real ID, which made him, again, he made him submit back when they were hiring just for kind of, and he says, just for this kind of situation. And so Carl stares at Curtis sitting across from him and he says, "You stole money from DPR?" And Curtis, who didn't steal a dime, just sits there probably thinking, what the hell is happening, right? Like, why am I getting framed for it? It's like, I didn't steal it. I was arrested at the time. But DPR doesn't want just justice. He wants revenge. And so he messages Knob and asks, "Do you know anyone who can rough him up, get my money back maybe?" And Carl, playing the role of a hardened smuggler, says, "Of course I do. How soon do you need it done?" And so they put on a show. They literally take Curtis Green into a hotel room. It's, who is it? It's like Carl Force, I think Sean Bridges too, and a couple other people. And the bathtub is filled up with water, camera rolling, and a postal worker, yes, a postal worker helping the task force at this time, dunks Curtis's head underwater, holds him there, and thrashes and gasps for air. Then he yanks him up by the hair and shoves his face in the camera. It's essentially a fake torture video, all on performance, designed to convince that DPR that they were roughing him up, because Eladio Guzman, the massive drug smuggler, had these connections, and of course he could take care of this problem for DPR. And it works. DPR is satisfied, and he thinks the problem has been handled. But this isn't just a scare tactic anymore. This is a very dark turning point. The moment where Ross, who once agreed that, or who once argued that liberty and free markets in college classrooms, is now ordering muscle on people he thinks betrayed him, even if they didn't. And the worst part, the guy who actually stole the money, Sean Bridges, was in the room watching this whole thing play out and said nothing. Obviously he couldn't, right? He'd be in big trouble. But Ross still didn't feel like the job was done. He didn't get his money back. He saw that they roughed him up, but that was kind of it. And if word got out that someone could snitch to the feds or steal money from the Silk Road and walk away untouched, it'd be game over. The fear, the authority, the myth of DPR, all gone. And so Ross turns to Knob, still believing Carr Force is a Southern American drug smuggling kingpin, and says, I'd like him beat up, force him to send my Bitcoin back, sit him at his computer, and make him do it. That was option one. He could scare him. Option two, rough him up really bad, break his fingers, maybe a few threats to his family, make it look really legitimate. But neither of these would really send a strong enough message. And then Variety Jones, who had real life experience in all this, basically channeled his inner dark side. And he says in the chat, at what point do we decide we've had enough of someone's shit and terminate them? He doesn't even call Curtis Green by his name anymore. They literally call him in the chats the organ donor. Just another broken piece of meat. Ross pauses and reflects. Just a few years ago, he was sleeping in a basement, making $300 a week as a research assistant, daydreaming in drum circles, wondering if that girl with the curly hair would call him back. Now, he was running a digital empire, and sitting in the big chair, he had the power, he made the laws, and in that moment, Ross decided that he would become the judge, jury, and, in this case, the executioner. And so he gives the order. Literally in the chat logs, it says, I would have no problem wasting this guy. And so DPR sends $40,000 in Bitcoin up front for the hit, and another $40,000 after it's done. And so Carl, playing Knob, fakes the entire thing, stages it again, films the drowning in the bathtub, and sends a photo to Ross as proof that they killed Curtis Green. Ross believes it because he sends them the proof. He sends them the pictures, the videos, all of it. And so he thinks he just made his first, he just had his first employee executed. Not because of violence, not because of danger, but it was to protect his reputation as DPR, the drug kingpin of the Silk Road. And from here on out, there's no going back. In Ross's mind, he just had his first person killed. And when he first started this Silk Road was just supposed to be to legalize drugs, let it be a free market, and let people buy whatever they wanted. And there's times in this book and in the chat logs where you can see where an early DPR was like, we will do everything, we'll make it a free market, no violence though. Months into this, he's now ordering his first few hits. And Ross isn't playing Libertarian Internet Pioneer anymore. He's essentially now playing God. This hit was sent out, and Ross had paid $80,000 with picture proof that Curtis was killed. So in his mind, he killed Curtis Green, even if he didn't actually get killed. But in his mind, he set out the hit, he got the proof, and it was valid. So up to this point, we've been kind of bouncing back. We've been talking about the Silk Road and DPR, the influence of Variety Jones, how Jared Derriagan gets involved, Carr Force and his entire knob personality and how he gets close to DPR. And the Silk Road investigation has mostly been in the hands of the DEA, HSI, and a few scattered agencies trying to get, their pieces together. But then one guy watching from the sidelines, itching to get in the game now, Chris Tarbell, the guy we mentioned in the FBI, who essentially is noted for taking down the drug kingpin Ross Ulbricht. He just finished taking down Losec, like we talked about, the elite hacker crew. He and his team were still riding the high, but now they eventually wanted more. After the celebration, their champagne, as they called it in the book, they met with a DEA agent, and in that conversation, something clicked with him. This site, the Silk Road, it wasn't just about selling drugs anymore. It was selling hacking tools, malware, keyloggers, Trojans, all the nasty digital stuff that fell directly under the FBI's cyber division. That was their angle. Instead of helping the DEA going after drug dealers, Tarbell's team realized we don't need to help them with their case. We can just open up our own. And so Tarbell picks up the phone, calls his bosses, and pitches them the strategy. Again, because you have to pitch it, you have to sell it to your higher-ups. It takes weeks of red tape approvals and classic government slowdown and bureaucracy, but eventually they get the green light and come through. They open a brand new case file, 288-3-696. And just like that, the cyber division of the FBI is officially hunting the dread Pirate Roberts. Now it's not just the HSI in Chicago, not just the DEA in Baltimore, not just the IRS or Postal Service poking around. Now the big dogs are in, and leading the charge is the guy that they called the Elliot Ness of cyberspace, Chris Tarbell. And the chase has just leveled up at this point. And again, he doesn't know, but essentially, I mean, Ross is fucked at this point. He's been hitting at the beehive, and now the wasps have come out. Now, in my eyes, we've presented all these characters. We've talked about the breakdown of it all. And honestly, this might come to some surprise to some people, but the most important in this entire case wasn't from the FBI or the DEA. It wasn't Chris Tarbell or Jared Deagan or all the people that we've talked about. It's actually this guy from the IRS. Yes, the Internal Revenue Service. And his name is Gary Alford. He wasn't flashy. No undercover ops, no cyber sting takedowns, nothing like that. He was just a quiet, suit-wearing IRS agent out of New York. But this dude was very different. When Gary was asked to join the task force, his job was very simple. He worked for the IRS, and so they asked him, "You're going to join the cyber division, and you're just going to follow the money. That's it." But here's the catch. Gary had never heard of the Silk Road. When his supervisor brought it up to him, they're like, "Do you know about the Silk Road?" "Nope, never heard of it." "Do you know about Tor?" "No." "Did you understand anything about Bitcoin?" "No." And so he didn't even really know how to use the dark web. But at this point, he was like, "Okay, I don't know anything, but it's fine. I'll learn about it, and maybe I'll be able to help." And Gary did just what he always did. He read. And I don't mean casually skimming. Gary had this very odd habit, this quirk. He would literally read everything 3 times: emails, articles, reports, books, even text messages 3 times. He believed it helped him remember more than anyone else in the room. And so when he started to read about Bitcoin, Tor, the Silk Road, 3 times through, he devoured that Gawker articles, deep dives, academic papers. And while the big name agencies had been chasing their tails for 2 years at this point, right? They were searching for 2 years. Gary just gets on scene, and he starts thinking about the case in a totally different way. He thought about something called the gambler's run problem after reading the Bitcoin white paper 3 times. It's a mathematical theory that says no matter how much money you have, if you keep betting against the house will win eventually. And Gary believed DPR was the gambler and the US government was the house. And if DPR kept playing this game, he would eventually lose. They would find a mistake and they would crack the case. But Gary needed a break. He needed his mistake and a clue that no one had seen yet, because for 2 years they'd been hunting this guy down, but because of Tor, the anonymity, and all this, they weren't able to find him. But Gary was born in the 1970s, so he thought back to his childhood in New York, and he thought about this famous case, specifically the Son of Sam killing in the 1970s. Now, if you're not familiar, the Son of Sam was a serial killer who terrorized New York City back in the 1970s. The guy killed 6 people, wounded 7 more, and just for over a year, the NYPD could not find this guy. They could not touch him. They threw everything they had at this case: detectives, task force, citywide alerts. Nothing worked. They couldn't catch this guy until one detective decided to try something very different. He thought in his mind, what if the killer had made a tiny mistake? Something that we just kind of overlooked, something very small. What if it's not about the crime scenes, the forensics, or the victim profiles, but something small, something that everyone overlooks, something boring? And so he actually started looking at parking tickets. Seriously. He checked with cars that got tickets near the crime scenes around the time of the attacks, because he thought if you were too busy committing a crime like murder or attacking people, you wouldn't have time or even think about paying your parking tickets. And boom, that is how they found him, a freaking parking ticket. And that's what stuck with Gary in this entire thing. While every agency had spent years trying to trace Bitcoin transactions, hunt down the servers, Gary thought, what if the Silk Road had a version of a parking ticket? Somewhere out there, maybe in a forum, a blog, an old comment thread, somewhere, there had to be a digital footprint, some tiny mistake made by whoever created the Silk Road before he came Dread Pirate Roberts, a digital parking ticket. And Gary believed that if he just kept reading, digging through old internet dust, he would find his digital parking ticket, and that was the massive difference. Other agents were chasing the monster, and Gary was chasing the receipt of the monster that he forgot to throw away. Now, I know we've been covering a lot of stuff up to this point, and there's been a lot of characters thrown at you. There's a lot of things happening, right? And the time frame that we're in right now is around the mid 2013. Now, if you remember from the first part of this, Ross gets arrested October 1st of 2013. Now what we're talking about is like the early to mid 2013. So this is where things really start to ramp up and everything just starts to really fall into place. So by the mid 2013s, things were really getting real for Ross. After the Curtis Green situation and the fake hit that he was put on, Ross decides that it's essentially time to disappear. At this time, he was living in San Francisco and he was living with a friend and his girlfriend in their apartment as Ross Ulbricht. But he knew that it was time to go into hiding, not DPR, but Ross Albrecht himself. And so he moves out of his friend's place and he changes his name to Joshua Terry, where then he looks to find an apartment in San Francisco that he can start paying rent in cash only and finds a quiet little apartment and keeps to himself. Essentially, this apartment is like there's like 5 or 6 rooms, and each room a different person is paying for, and they all pay in cash. And everyone there knows him as Joshua Terry. And he tells his landlord that he's just a currency trader and a freelance IT guy, and he recently moved back from Australia. Nothing suspicious, just another guy in his 20s looking to work remotely. But behind the scenes, he's running the biggest illegal marketplace in the world and is starting to lose his mind from paranoia and starting to lose control. Because after Curtis Green, it didn't stop. Ross had already ordered 1 hit, but now he ordered 4 more. Here's what happened. So you kind of get the context. Someone tried to extort DPR. He threatened to leak hundreds of Silk Road usernames and addresses until Ross sent him $500,000 in Bitcoin. Obviously, Ross always had an issue with hackers, and this hacker was pretty good, and he got a lot of this information. And again, he was threatening DPR. One person had already done that, Curtis Green. He'd stolen money from him, and he ordered a hit on him. Ross refuses, and he doesn't want to look weak again, because if he does, more hackers are going to show up and, people are going to take advantage of him. So what does he do? He hires the Hells Angels, which is essentially like an anonymous group. It's where you hire hitmen, and he finds them through the Silk Road. Yeah, so he's essentially hiring these people to kill for him. And he finds them through the contacts on the Silk Road. They quote him $150,000 for a clean job. And Ross thinks it's a little steep, and he says that he would pay half now and then half when the thing is done. But he agrees. Soon after, he gets an email. Your problem has been taken care of. He won't be blackmailing anyone ever again. But it's not over. The same guy had told 4 other people about the whole same blackmail info. And one of them goes by the name of Tony76. And again, Ross doesn't blink, messages the Hells Angels again, and sends them $500,000 to the Angels to take care of this person and also the 3 roommates that he lived with without even blinking an eye. And in his journal, in his actual journal that he wrote, Ross actually logs it like it's just another task on his to-do list. And it goes on to say, quote, sent payments to Angels for hit on Tony76 and his 3 associates. Then, right underneath, like nothing ever happened, refactored main and category pages to be more efficient. Like murder, then server maintenance. This is the guy who once said that the Silk Road was about freedom and non-aggression, and now he's just casually ordering hits and optimizing it like it's code and nothing ever happened. And meanwhile, Variety Jones gives him more advice, straight out of the gangster playbook. He says, you probably need a dirty cop on your payroll. And so DPR listens. He puts out feelers, bribes people through the site, and eventually he gets a couple of so-called informants inside the government. They claim that they can feed him intel on law enforcement investigations for $50,000 per tip. And at this point, the Silk Road has passed 1 million users. And Ross is managing a criminal empire, ordering murders, paying off dirty cops, and living under a fake name. And somehow, he still thinks that he can continue to keep this going. And what's crazy is you have to remember that this is still mid-2013. He created the Silk Road back in February of 2011. So literally over the span of just about 2 years, he's evolved from Ross Ulbricht to DPR. And you can see how quickly the lines have been blurred from saying that, the Silk Road's about free markets and non-aggression, to literally just hiring hits on people. And people that aren't even involved in it, they're just roommates of a guy that fucked with him. And so now they get killed too. It's crazy to see this. And in the chat logs, you could really see him evolve from Ross Ulbricht to DPR and just how dangerous he gets. So by now, Ross, or DPR, has essentially crossed every single line. He wasn't just running the Silk Road, he was ordering hits, paying off dirty cops, running a growing empire of crime and ideology. And Carl Force, the DEA agent as Knob, was watching it all unfold in real time, and something changed. Carl noticed that DPR was now acting differently because, again, DPR would talk to Variety Jones very personally, the same way that he would talk to Knob, who's Carl Force, the DEA agent. So he saw this all unfold in their private chats where everything was documented. And so the man who once hesitated about using force now spoke with power and certainty. Ross even told him one time, I chose this life. I wasn't forced. I'll do whatever it takes to see it through. He wasn't flinching anymore. He was convinced Silk Road would get so big it would force governments to legalize drugs. It was a full-on revolution in his head, and he was ready to die for it. Now, here's where things get really insane. Because DPR, as he was throwing out feelers for dirty cops, looking for a mole inside law enforcement, he wants someone on the inside to tip him off when, the walls are starting to close in and the feds are starting to get close. Carl sees his opportunity because, again, he talks back and forth with him pretty frequently. He makes one up. Knob tells DPR, literally in the chat logs, I know a guy, a dirty government official, name's Kevin. He's close to the case, so he could feed us information for the right price. Of course, Kevin doesn't exist. He's just Carl pretending to be a crooked cop while already pretending to be a drug smuggler. So now Carl is playing three roles. Carl Force, the DEA agent, Knob, the international drug pen who's undercover through the DEA, and Kevin, a crooked cop feeding DPR intel for cash. And so he tells DPR, Kevin came to me, said he knows something that says he knows there's an investigation, and he's willing to sell details for $50,000 to $100,000 a pop for information. And DPR buys it. He loves the idea and starts sending payments. Now, it's important to know, as Knob, everything is documented. So he's talking about it, everything that's written goes into a log, the supervisors review it, and so obviously he can't pretend to be Kevin on these chats because it goes to a supervisor, and he would know that obviously this is very, very illegal. And so he tells DPR as Knob that, hey, if you want to talk to Kevin, we have to go on a highly encrypted, secure chat site. Obviously, huge red flag because that's documented in the files, but they don't really think anything of it. They think that he's just going a little more undercover, but this is where he becomes Kevin. And so through this encrypted chat, it's essentially now Kevin and DPR talking about selling secrets, which is really just Carl Force telling him all the DEA secrets for $50,000 to $100,000 a pop. And these Bitcoins would move from the Silk Road to Carl's own wallet. Over time, Carl racks up over $750,000 in donations from the man he's supposed to be bringing to justice. But obviously, Carl isn't dumb. He knows that the conversations are being logged. And so he tells DPR in his chat, hey, let's move to the PGP. It's encrypted, totally private. Now, again, like I mentioned just a little moment ago, the DEA can read these messages, but in the PGP, they can't. So Carl has cut off oversight and has gone completely rogue as Kevin. He's feeding DPR about these tips about arrests, suspects, investigations, like literal, real intelligence to help Ross stay one step ahead of the feds. And it's the ultimate betrayal. The guy leading the sting is also protecting the target and getting rich off of it at the same time. And the craziest part, at this point, nobody knows. Obviously, we'll eventually find out once everything turns south for Ross. Now, kind of coming back to Gary Alford, the IRS agent, the guy who nobody expected to be a major part or player in this case, eventually now at this point becomes completely obsessed with the Silk Road. In months' time, he's scouring through the rep, he's looking through everything. He's been reading everything about the Silk Road, Bitcoin, Tor, forums, all of it, again, 3 times over like he always does, but nothing has clicked this far. Until one random Friday in May 2013, Gary's in his bed with his laptop scrolling, and then suddenly he asks himself a question. What's the earliest mention of the Silk Road online? Who was the first person to ever talk about it publicly? Everyone thought it was the Gawker article, so we went to there. And eventually, he thought it was Adrian Chen who was actually the owner of it. But then in the articles, like we talked about, he sees that Adrian Chen actually spoke to the founder of Silk Road and made the site famous. So Gary opens up Google and types in silkroad.onion and sets the date filter to anything before June 1st, 2011, the date of the Gawker article. And then he gets it. A forum post pops up on a site called The Shroomery. Remember how I told you to keep this information in the back of your head at the beginning of the episode? It's dated January 27, 2011, posted at 4:20 p.m., just weeks after the Silk Road supposedly launched. Again, posted at 4:20. Yeah, I know, 4:20. And the username under this, Altoid. Gary keeps digging. He then starts requesting records from the forum using his government credentials to kind of go into the back servers and see all this information. He finds the name Altoid account linked to a very sketchy email, frosty@frosty.com. It's fake, it's a dead end. But then there's more. On Stack Overflow, the programming Q&A site, Gary finds the same Altoid username again, and this time, jackpot. He finds that the account had originally been registered under a different name, not frosty@frosty.com, before someone had changed it. The original email posted under Altoid, which was then changed 2 minutes later, the email he found, rossalbrecht@gmail.com. Gary stares at the screen, doesn't freak out, doesn't sprint in the office telling everyone that he found him. Instead, he calmly writes the name down and keeps digging. Because even though this looks big, even though this might be the guy, Gary wasn't sure. Because at this time, there were, I think, like over 20 people who the feds were like, this is DPR, this is DPR. And so obviously Gary doesn't want to look like a fool and just be like, well, I found the guy based off a Google search. So right now, he doesn't know that this is the actual Silk Road DPR. He just thinks it's very interesting. So he keeps the name Ross Ulbricht in the back of his mind. He doesn't know that he essentially found the digital equivalent of his parking ticket. Not proof, but the first real breadcrumb. Now, while the rest of the law enforcement had been chasing leads for 2 years, Gary Alford, the IRS agent, outsider, obsessive reader, reading everything 3 times, had literally just found DPR. And the man behind it, a white guy from Texas in his late 20s, no formal computer science background, named Ross Albrecht. But Gary wasn't ready to close the case. He, again, shelved the name, put it aside, wasn't really sure, but he continued to file it alongside a few suspects that kind of looked pretty legit. And so we went right back to reading 3 times over. Now, by the mid-2013s, I think this is around like June, July timeframe, if I'm not mistaken, essentially every federal agency you can imagine was working on the Silk Road case. The DEA, the FBI, IRS, HSI, everybody. Postal Inspector, Secret Service, cybercrime units from multiple cities, and guess what? None of them were playing nice. Everyone wanted to win the case because the glory of cracking this case would be monumental. Because again, not only did you have to sell to your higher-ups to work on a case, but if you were the one to break it down, especially something as crazy as the Silk Road, you got a lot of publicity, and that was really good for you. But again, not everyone gets credit. It's only the people who essentially arrest the guy. And so the Department of Justice steps in and says, okay, enough. We're wasting time and money. Let's get in the same room and put our cards on the table. And so they called a deconfliction meeting, basically an all-hands meeting to figure out what's going on. It's essentially when multiple agencies, and again, I found this out through the Chris Tarbell interview with Lex Friedman. He explains what the deconfliction meeting is when multiple agencies are working on a case together and they're not sharing information with each other, or they're just hiding things from each other because they want to win the case. Eventually all come together, lay everything out flat, and the Department of Justice decides, okay, the FBI, the DEA, whoever is going to head the case, and they will be in charge and be credited with the arrest. And so that's essentially what they're doing here. Everyone's expected to show up who's involved in the case. Show up, share what they've got. Except one guy's missing, Carl Force. The DEA agent who's undercover persona Knob, yeah, he doesn't show up. Weird, right? Little suspicious. And even when someone asks directly about his operation, the DEA rep shuts it down, and she basically says, that's 6A, which basically means it's part of a grand jury investigation and off limits. But everyone in the room knows that's BS. This meeting was supposed to be the place to share everything. And so they basically go back and forth. They say in the book, over 40 minutes they're arguing. They're like, where's Carl Force? And his team's like, well, that's 6E, like we can't tell you. Because they kind of know like Carl Force as Knob has been kind of blurring the lines and they don't really want to share that because that kind of looks bad on their part. Now, eventually, the department just is like, all right, whatever, we're going to get through with it. We're going to go to the next person. Now, cue Jared Derjagan, the HSI agent from Chicago, who's essentially been doing all his undercover work by himself, logging this, taking down small-time drug dealers, doing it all by himself. Now, while Carl's been hiding in the shadow, Jared stands up and absolutely crushes it. He gives a literal 40 minutes presentation, explains how he's, over the 2 years, seized over 3,000 packages of drugs, broke down how Silk Road vendors operated, showed how he'd even taken over accounts of top Silk Road employees to spy on meetings from the inside. He literally brought charts and diagrams explaining the hierarchy of the site. And back in New York, FBI, Chris Tarbell, and his partner, Saren, who he turns to his lead attorney and says, I want to work with this guy. And the attorney just nods. Game recognizes game. And that's when it's the FBI's turn. And then they drop an absolute bombshell. Their attorney stands up and says one sentence. We have the Silk Road server. Silence. Everyone goes silent because they understand how big this is. Every head in the room whips around. People start murmuring. The Silk Road server, the core infrastructure, the heart of the entire operation, yep, they found it in Iceland. Now, it turns out that someone on the Silk Road messed up on the site's code, obviously Ross Albrecht, and for a short time, the real IP address became visible. Now, that was all the FBI needed. Tarbell and his team grabbed it, and now they're cyber experts. Were working to rebuild it, carefully digging through all the files. And they told everyone to wait. No one else could have access to it. We don't even know what we have yet, they said. Let us look first. Right, because they want to be the ones who crack the case. And so they're like, we have this huge bombshell. We just let you guys know about it. But you know what? First, let us take a look at it. And so the Department of Justice wraps the meeting up. Everyone walks away with new respect, little frustration, and a lot more urgency. And sitting quietly the whole time, Gary Alford from the IRS. He had just found Ross Ulbricht's name tied to Altoid account weeks earlier before this deconfliction meeting, the digital parking ticket that could crack the case. But Gary, he didn't say anything. He just stayed quiet because after hearing about the server, he figured, I mean, the FBI is already on it. These guys are weeks away from finding the same thing I did, so I just don't need to jump the gun and look like an idiot here. So he held on to the name Ross Albrecht and didn't say it in that meeting. While everyone thought that they were still chasing a ghost, he knew who the real DPR was, but he didn't share it in this. Now, kind of transitioning back to Ross Albrecht. So at this point, Ross is living under the name Josh Terry, renting a place in San Francisco, paying in cash, hiding in plain sight. And then he makes a rookie mistake. He orders 9 fake IDs to his apartment. Huge slip up because customs flags the package. It gets held up at the airport, and some Homeland Security sends agents to a guy named Ramirez. That's the Homeland Security agent that takes over. And he's basically going to do a knock and talk at the address. But Ramirez actually screws it up. He drives, because where Ross lived, he drives to 15th Street instead of 15th Avenue, wrong house, knocks on the door. This Asian guy comes out and he's like, get off my property, like, get out of here. And so Ramirez is like, oh, like, this doesn't really seem like a Ross Albert guy. So, okay, maybe this is a dead end. But a couple weeks later, he finds out that he went to the wrong address. And so what he does, he doesn't have time, so he sends out 2 new agents to follow up at the right address, 15th Avenue, not 15th Street. And this time they get the right address. And on July 26, 2013, a Jeep pulls up. 2 DHS agents get out with a printout of the fake IDs, the 9 fake IDs, all with pictures of Ross, some with a beard, some with not, totally different names. They walk up to the door, ready to knock, and as they see peering through the window, suddenly Ross is walking right across. They both lock eyes and they're looking at each other. And Ross at this point is like, fuck, this is where it all ends. And so they knock on the door, and suddenly Ross opens the door, shirtless with literally just a pair of wrinkled khaki shorts, no shoes, no nothing. And he freezes, they freeze. And the agents hold up the printouts, look down, and then look back at Ross. Same face, same guy. And so the man is ordered, The man who ordered 9 fake IDs is standing right in front of him, and they say, "Can you come outside and talk to us for a little bit?" And at that split second, Ross thinks it's completely over. They're here to arrest him as the man DPR for the Silk Road. So he steps outside, hand shaky, face pale, sweating, and he says, "We're here to talk about the fake IDs that were mailed here," one of them says. Ross then starts to sweat in his mind. He says, "Fudge," right? Because he doesn't say fuck. "This is it. They got me." But here's the twist. These agents had no idea who he really was. They didn't even know what the Silk Road was. They didn't even know about DPR or any of this that was going on. They just think that it was some guy ordering bogus IDs. And oddly enough, it was 9 fake IDs. And so they try to calm him down, and they're like, look, we're not here to arrest you. We just need to talk. And as they talk, Ross's panic starts to fade. His hand stops shaking. The color returns to his face. And then eventually they're just like, "Look, we're not here to arrest you. We just want to know about the fake IDs. And we're just speaking in hypotheticals here." And in the book, it says, completely hypotheticals, right? Yes, just hypotheticals. And so Ross, literally at this point, moments thinking he was going to be arrested as DPR for the Silk Road, starts messing with the agents. Like, literally, he starts talking about the Silk Road with these agents. Like, he literally says, "So hypothetically, anyone could use Tor Network to access a site called Silk Road where they could buy anything: guns, drugs, fake IDs." And the agents look at each other. Uh, what the hell is Silk Road? They don't know. They just nod politely and take notes. And so they eventually let Ross go. They don't arrest him for the 9 fake IDs. And just like that, he slips right through their fingers, totally unknowing that they were just talking to DPR, the guy in charge of this massive drug empire. But what they do is they document the whole conversation. They write up the encounter and they write the name Ross Ulbricht because they wanted his real ID to know that, like, hey, you ordered 9 fake IDs. We need to see your real ID, document all this. They don't realize it, but they've just brushed up against the kingpin of the dark web and let him walk out the front door inside the house. Ross rushes back to his room, scrambling over his tracks, and he's thinking, holy shit. One of the things he gave him also was a completely fake and made up email that he gave him. The apartment lease was in someone else's name. If DHS connects the dots and calls his landlord, the whole thing could come crashing down. But somehow, he just gets away with it, at least for now. Now, by September 2013, I mean, we're literally a month away from the arrest of Ross Ulbricht. September 2013, Gary Alford was just ready to give up because he was like, you know what? None of this is going to work. The FBI is going to get their guy. He had spent months obsessing over the Silk Road, reading every article, forum post, and Reddit comment, again, 3 times over, just like always, and still nothing conclusive except for that name, Ross Ulbricht. And as he just felt burned out at this point. But then something totally unexpected happened and snapped right back into him. As he was sitting in his desk in New York, again, September, around the time, just 12 years earlier, where 9/11 was talking, he overheard 2 agents near his cubicle talking about the terrorism of 9/11, sick first responders, friends they'd lost, everything. And then eventually, Gary got mad. He didn't just see DPR anymore as some libertarian selling drugs. He was running essentially a terrorist organization because now he was selling guns, ordering hits, and there was all this stuff happening. And he saw it as a threat, someone who can undermine the country from the shadows. And that's when it hit him. He's like, no, that's it. It's him. It's Ross Ulbricht. He just came to the conclusion. He was so convinced. He's like, this is the guy. Like, it has to be. I have to look at his name one more time. I need to get everything that I can on him. And so Gary gets up and walks over to a woman from Homeland Security and says, hey, can you run a background check on Ross Ulbricht again? And so she pulls up the file, nothing unusual, until she freezes. You know that there's a hit on this guy, right? And Gary responds, wait, what? And she explains Ross was recently questioned by DHS just a couple weeks ago about 9 fake IDs sent to his apartment, and then she reads the report from the field agent. Ross, while being questioned, had voluntarily told them about Bitcoin Tor and the Silk Road. He just gave it up like it was small talk. And Gary's brain is on fire. He's like, there's absolutely no coincidence. Like, this has to be our guy. And so he jumps into action. He calls Saren Turner, which is the assistant U.S. attorney working with the FBI, working with Chris Tarbell. And he goes on to say, we need to get everybody on a call right now. Me, you, Jared, and Tarbell. These are the main guys working on the case at this point. And so a few hours later, they're all on the line. Gary Sarin, Chris Tarbell, and Jared Derriagan, and Gary Alford. The key players now circling their prey. Gary starts walking them through his entire research, how he got to this point and why he thinks Ross Ulbricht is the guy. He says that he went to a Google search that led him to the Shroomy post. The username was under Altoid. He trailed that lead, leaving to Stack Overflow. And finally, the account that tied it all together was rossalbrecht@gmail.com. And then he adds one more detail. This was changed from frosty@frosty.com. And when he says Frosty, the line goes quiet. And then Tarbell speaks up. He's like, did you just say Frosty? And Gary's confused. He's like, I just laid all this out for you. I gave you all this information, and you're concerned about the name Frosty? And Tarbell's like, no. Are you saying Frosty? Yes, Frosty. Why? Why does it matter? Then Tarbell drops it. The name of the server, the Silk Road server we seized in Iceland, was named Frosty. Ooh, I got goosebumps just reading that. I mean, how crazy is it? Like, let's just backtrack a little and talk about that. Gary Alford, an IRS agent, literally tasked with just tracking the money, eventually goes down this road, obsesses over it, just by a Google search, logs in this name, finds Altoid, finds his email, sees it as frosty@frosty.com, thinks nothing of it, and then finds rossalbrecht@gmail.com. After months and months and months of digging, eventually he's like, you know what, this is our guy, let's go for it. And as he's laying this all out, remember in that deconfliction meeting, they said that they found the server that hosted the Silk Road in Iceland. When he's like, oh, it's frosty@frosty@gmail.com, Chris Tarbell's like, dude, Frosty is the name of the server in Iceland that hosts the Silk Road, which is tied to frosty@frosty@gmail.com or frosty@frosty.com, which is tied to rossalbrecht@gmail.com, which is the same guy just a few weeks ago buying 9 fake IDs who was talking about the Silk Road. And that's when it clicked. They've got him. The ghost, the libertarian kingpin, the dread pirate Roberts. It's Ross Ulbricht. Gary found the crack, Tarbell had the hammer, and now they were just going to bring him down. And so now, after this, they knew that they had the guy. Well, they kind of knew. They had to track him down. They had to make sure that they got this right. And so after the phone call, the moment when Gary said that the word Frosty, everything clicked. And now the clock was ticking. Ross Ulbricht is now the #1 target on a full-scale federal manhunt. San Francisco SWAT gets called in, and they eventually say, you need to follow this guy. So they're told, follow this guy, watch his every move for weeks. Don't make contact with him. Just keep an eye on him at all times. And for weeks, Ross is under heavy surveillance. Literally, San Francisco SWAT, the FBI, everybody, they're watching him. They're doing everything. He goes to coffee shops, libraries, co-working places, always bouncing between public Wi-Fi spots, just him and his laptop. And the feds are watching everything. And then eventually they're like, the time has come. And the FBI tells Chris Tarbell and their team, it's time, we're moving in. And Chris Tarbell, the cybercrime mastermind behind taking down the Silk Road server, he hears this and freaks out because he knows that so here's the thing. Ross's laptop was the entire case. Because this isn't just a typical drug bust, they're not going to find a ton of drugs. They need to arrest Ross with his laptop open in the servers. Without the laptop, or even if he mentioned to close the lid, encrypt everything, hit the kill switch, encrypt the files, it's game over. They would have nothing, no chat logs, no proof he was DPR. And because they wouldn't be able to get into the encrypted back end of it all, he would eventually get free and the whole case would fall apart. And to make matters worse, everyone in the government knew that this was going down at this point. Word made its way all the way to the President of the United States. This bust was too big to fail. And so Tarbell tries to slow things down and he begs them. He's like, we cannot go in with a SWAT team. We need to essentially take him down a different way. We need to make sure that laptop is open and he's logged in. This is literally what the FBI says. He's like, you get one day. Tomorrow, we are breaking into Ross's apartment and we're taking him down SWAT style. And so that's it. One day to come up with a plan, not just to arrest Ross, but to catch him in the act, fingers on the keyboard, locked into the Silk Road servers. Anything less, it's done. And the reason that this was so important is because during the LulzSec case, when they arrested one of the guys in LulzSec, they did it SWAT style, like they always did. But what the guy did was he closed his laptop, he clicked a kill switch, and everything was encrypted. And so they almost lost the case because, yeah, they caught the guy, they had a lot of evidence on him and everything, but they couldn't prove it because they couldn't get into the files. And so Chris Tarbell knew that with the Lawsec case, if you don't catch this guy with his laptop open, with him signed in, we literally don't have the evidence. Like, you won't be able to arrest this guy because you won't be able to prove it was him. And so they knew that they had to get him logged in literally into this. Now, what's interesting too is they know, so they've been tracking him for weeks, and this is why Jared Darriagan was really important to this case as well, because as I mentioned earlier, Jared Darriagan during the deconfliction meeting said that he was able to take over some of the admin accounts. He busted them, he took over the accounts, and so he was actually able to track when DPR logged into the Silk Road servers was the same exact time that Ross was on his laptop. And so they can kind of like triangulate when DPR came online. That was the same exact time that Ross was using his laptop. And so that's how they were able to also further prove that, like, yes, Ross Albrecht is our guy. But again, there's massive importance that they absolutely needed Ross at his laptop, fingers on the keyboard, not logged out. And so they literally had 24 hours at this point to catch him like that. And now, obviously, because Carl Force is part of the DEA and he's involved in all this, he knows that he is absolutely fucked. As the FBI moved closer and closer to making the arrest, Carl Force was starting to lose it. He gets word from above, Baltimore is to stand down on all Silk Road activity. Translation, the FBI is about to move in on Ross. Carl knows that if Ross gets caught, they seize the laptop, all his dirty little secrets come spilling out. Because remember, Carl wasn't just undercover, he was pretending to be Kevin, the crooked cop selling information to DPR, and that would get all tied back to him. And so now he's terrified that those conversations are still saved. And so what does he do? He starts frantically messaging DPR, trying to cover his tracks. One of his messages basically reads like a panicked mob threat. Kevin is certain you're going to get identified and caught. You're literally like family to me, but I've had people killed before. It's very easy and cheap. And then he begs, I trust you've deleted our chats and messages. Like, he literally starts messaging him on the PGP, and he's like, dude, you need to delete all these messages because if you get caught, we cannot get caught with you. But he doesn't stop there. Carl starts spiraling in paranoia and starts switching identities because he starts freaking out, and he's like, holy shit, I cannot get caught. And so he starts messaging Ross as a new person, a fourth person. He was Carl Force, Knob, Kevin, and now he messages DPR as French Maid, another fake profile that he created. And in a panic, he slips. He literally signs the message as his real name. He ends the message with Carl, as in Carl Force from the DEA. And you can see, like, he's absolutely losing this. He realizes seconds later and scrambles over and follows the message up with, whoops, my name is Carla Sophia, and I have many boyfriends and girlfriends on the marketplace. XOXO winky face. I mean, seriously, that's what he wrote. That's what's in the chat logs. Now, this guy is unraveling like a soap opera villain at this point, and still he's not done panicking because in a desperate attempt, he knows that what the FBI has, they're going to close in on him. And eventually, if they found all the chat logs on the Silk Road servers, he'd be fucked. And so he actually picks up the phone and calls Chris Tarbell, and he's like, you know what? He's like, hey, this is Special Agent Carl Force. When can I come see the Silk Road server? And Tarbell's like, who are you? And Carl tries to buff, like, no, like, I'm part of the DEA, Baltimore, like, I got approval from ASAC. I really need to see these servers. Like, he's trying to delete all his stuff. And Tarbell's like, dude, I got too much on my plate. Like, go through the proper channels. Click, hangs up. And at that point, Carl knows that he's out of options. His only hope is that Ross deletes the emails or Ross escapes. I mean, the whole house of cards is starting to collapse on both of them, but deep down, Carl knows the truth. If they catch Ross, they catch me. Now, I would like to say that I can create a script that would break this entire arrest down that was good to read, but honestly, that the way that the author documented this entire thing in chapter 64 and 65 is so good that for this entire part, from the last 24 hours of Ross Ulbricht being free to how he got arrested. I'm just going to read straight from the book itself because it's so good how it's put. And I just don't want to fuck this up because this is such an important part in the entire story. So I'm just going to read those 2 chapters, and we're just going to go over literally the final 24 hours of Ross Ulbricht and how the entire arrest went down. So bear with me here. The last day of Ross's life as a free man began just like any other. He woke up on his Monterey Boulevard apartment and slipped into his blue jeans and long-sleeve red t-shirt. Then he got to work on the Silk Road, unaware that by 3:16 p.m. that day, he would be sitting in the back of a police car in handcuffs. He had been blue for the past few days as things were not going his way. First of his many government employees who went by the moniker French Maid had told him that the feds had a new name to add to the list of people who could potentially be Dread Pirate Roberts, and French Maid, who had said that her name was Carla Sophia, would happily share the name in exchange for $100,000. Carl was still trying to get his money, so DPR had paid and was still waiting for a response. Then another employee to whom he had loaned $500,000 had disappeared. To top it all off, his poison oak rash hadn't gone away fully. But there were things to be grateful for. Ross was soon going to Austin, where he would see Julia, the same person that he dated when he was in Austin. She had told him in an email that she would pick him up from the airport and he could stay with her, just like old times. They had been having romantic Skype sessions a lot too, and sending long, dirty emails back and forth about what they would do to each other in person. Rod had also had an epiphany over the weekend. After the bonfire and the fireworks on the ocean beach, he had written in his diary alongside his travails on the Silk Road and had an explanation of how he got the poison oak rash, that he needed to eat well, get good sleep, and meditate so I can stay positive. 12:15 p.m. The house along Monterey Boulevard were mostly 2- and 3-story wood frames. They were painted all different colors, some white, others blue and green. The apartment where Ross Ulbricht now lived was in a 3-story beige building in the middle of the block. Every once in a while, a large suburban SUV with dark-tinted windows would drive by. The SUV would make a right turn down Bandon Street and then another right and another, until it found itself back in front of the beige building on Monterey Boulevard. Even if anyone had noticed the USV as it swirled around the blocks that morning, no one would have guessed what was inside the vehicle. 2:42 p.m. Tarbell paced in front of the coffee shop at Diamond Street, staring down at his phone, trying desperately to figure out what to do. He had gone to the local FBI offices and made his case that they shouldn't use SWAT team. But the supervisor in charge of the local bureau had issued a flat-out no. The supervisor said he wasn't going to risk losing an agent over an open laptop. Clearly, he didn't know how important that computer was. Tarbell called over to everyone he knew in the government, trying to persuade them not to go into Ross's house with a battering ram and guns drawn. But all he could get out of the local FBI office was an agreement to delay the SWAT team by 1 day. Jared, Tom, and Brophy stood in front of the cafe near Ross's house, listening to Tarbell explain this. Unsure what they were going to do, they knew that Ross was at home on his laptop because the FBI had an undercover SUV circling his block and monitoring his Wi-Fi traffic. The system they were using would check the signal strength of the Wi-Fi on his computer, and then, by triangulating the data from 3 different points they had captured as they drove around the block, they were able to figure out Ross's exact location, which at that very moment was his bedroom on the 3rd floor of his Monterey Boulevard apartment. As the agents stood outside the cafe discussing their conundrum, Jared looked at his computer to check his battery level, now on the red and quickly falling past 18%. In that moment, he noticed that the icon next to Dread Pirate Roberts vanished from the chat window. DPR just logged off, Jared said. I'm going into the Bello Cafe and charge my shit and get a coffee. Tom followed him, leaving Brophy and Tarbell outside. The coffee shop was bustling, and every seat was occupied by a laptop-toting patron. A few moms sipped tea with a hand of their strollers, and others stared at their phones. Jared found a single free power outlet along the wall, plugged in his computer, and ordered a coffee. After 2 years of slogging up a mountain of shit, they were so close to DPR they could practically hear him breathing, and yet they had lost. The SWAT team was going in. They wouldn't capture the open laptop. They wouldn't get Ross Ulbricht logged into the site. 2:46 p.m. Ross grabbed his laptop, stuffed it into his shoulder bag, and headed downstairs onto Monterey Boulevard. The air was unusually warm, with a slight chill from the San Francisco breeze. He had been in the house all day and needed to change locations. Plus, he wanted fast Wi-Fi connection so he could download an interview with the creator of the show Breaking Bad. The show's final episode, Felina, had aired the night before and had left the protagonist Walter White and his alter ego Heisenberg dead. Ross wouldn't be out long. Maybe just a couple hours to mooch Wi-Fi from a nearby coffee shop, download the show, and do some work on the Silk Road. 2:50 p.m. Tarbell was watching the street when his phone vibrated with a message from the undercover FBI agents who had been monitoring Ross. He's on the move, they wrote. Tarbell quickly ducked into the coffee shop and alerted Jared and Tom. Our friend is coming down the street, Tarbell said aggressively to Jared. His voice was gruff at this point. Jared looked at him, exhausted and confused what Tarbell was saying. Which friend? Jared asked, thinking that he could get another Tarbell joke. Our friend, Tarbell said, is coming. He couldn't exactly put out Ross Ulbricht or Dread Pirate Roberts or the criminal mastermind you've been after for 2 fucking years. And then it hit Jared. Holy shit, our friend. He grabbed his coffee and laptop, came rushing outside, and ran across the street to a park bench with Tom, where they tried their best to blend in with the world around them. 2:51 p.m. Tarbell exited the coffee shop. Description and direction he wrote on his BlackBerry to the undercover agents. Everyone in Tarbell's crew scattered. Brophy cut right to hide in the library a few doors down. He had seen Tom rushing across the street, taking a seat on a bench in front of a pizza place. Jared was not far behind him. Tarbell turned in the street in the direction only direction left and started walking south along Diamond Street right into the path of Ross Ulbricht. Tarbell knew that the undercover FBI agents would be following Ross, but he wanted to get a glimpse of him firsthand. Cars and people flowed in all directions as Tarbell approached the crosswalk. The world was moving at a perfectly normal pace, yet for Tarbell it was operating so much slower. His heart hammered in his chest as he knew he was about to come face to face with Dread Pirate Roberts. And then he did. As Tarbell crossed the street, as if he were doing it so in slow motion, he noticed every detail of his surroundings, the birds flapping through the air, the colors of the cars on the road, the chip paint in the yellow crosswalk, and the man now walking into his path, who was wearing blue jeans and a long-sleeve red t-shirt, had a brown laptop bag over his shoulder. Tarbell took another step forward into the median on the road and looked directly into the eyes of Ross and looked back at him. 3:02 p.m. Ross continued along the crosswalk and walked up to Bellow Coffee. The coffee shop was bustling. Every seat was taken by someone with an open laptop or a mother with a stroller. He had told his employees the importance of being safe in a coffee shop, once offering Inigo this advice, quote, take your laptop and find a spot in the cafe where your screen won't be visible to anyone. Get a large coffee, sit down, and don't get up except to stretch. Given that there was nowhere for Ross to sit that adhered to that protocol, he turned around and walked back outside. He had a lot on his mind, as always. He had made plans with Julia to video chat that evening. Quote, can we Skype tonight? She had asked over email. Sure, what time? Is 8 my time good? Sure, see you then, he wrote, following with a smiley face, as he knew exactly what kind of Skyping they'd be doing. The air was calm as Ross contemplated where to go next. He needed Wi-Fi, but didn't have many options at 3 p.m. in this sleepy corner of the city. He looked to his left in the direction that he had just came from, and knew Cup Coffee Bar had closed an hour earlier. Straight ahead of him, cars streamed by. A woman walked with her daughter, and 2 men sat on the wooden park bench, one staring at his laptop and the other looking at his phone. Ross continued to scan the street, his eyes sliding past the burrito shop, then past the local pub, until he turned to his right, staring at the Glen Park Public Library. 3:03 p.m. Jared and Tom sat on the bench, gazing straight ahead as if they were in a staring contest with the coffee shop. Jared's laptop was open, and Tom was on his smartphone in his hand. They could see Ross walk out of the cafe, holding onto his bag. Ross was peering around and then looked directly in the direction of Jared and Tom as they both quickly looked away, trying to seem inconspicuous. Quote, I bet he's looking for Wi-Fi, Jared whispered under his breath to Tom. They watched out over the corners of their eyes as Ross walked to his right toward the public library. At almost that exact moment, Tarbell appeared. his phone in his hand as if he read updates from the undercover agents trailing Ross. "Where's he at?" Tarbell asked. Jared motioned towards the library. At that moment, Tarbell, who had gone by the book his entire life, had to decide what to do. He had studied and practiced for every single moment in his life, no matter how small. Yet now, he didn't know if he should follow the rules or break them. He was fully aware of the local FBI office would be apologetic if they knew that he was contemplating trying to arrest Ross Ulbricht without the SWAT team present, but he had no choice. If he wanted to catch the Dread Pirate Roberts on laptop, he looked down at Jared, then over to Tom, then to the library, and a thought rang out of his head. Fuck it. Go to the library and get in position, he told Tom. Do nothing, say nothing, just blend in. As Tarbell looked down at his phone, he was fully aware that a few miles south of where he stood at that very moment, dozens of SWAT team members were shuffling into a conference room at the local bureau office, preparing to run through a drill how they would apprehend Ross Ulbricht, guns drawn, the following day. He tapped out another email to let his crew know the plan, that they were going into the library to try to capture Ross Ulbricht. This meant that the men in the SWAT team meeting would see the message too. In a few minutes, they would be running towards their cruisers, sirens blaring and lights flashing, racing north along 101 freeway past San Francisco Airport in the direction of Placid Glen Park toward the little library. 3:06 p.m. To the right of the library stacks, a couple of children sat at small tables with small chairs, quietly flipping through the pages of small storybooks. A few other patrons milled about between the stacks. It was a diminutive library, reminiscent of Good Wagon Books warehouse, which is what Ross was doing when he was awesome before the Silk Road, where most of the sections were composed of only one or two bookshelves. Ross walked toward a round beige table nestled between the science fiction section and the romance novels. He sat down, pulled his laptop out of his bag, and watched as the computer came to life. 3:08 p.m. In the corner of the room, Brophy reached for his BlackBerry and sent a note out to the FBI agents, seated northwest corner. At the park bench in front of the library, Tarbell was pacing. DPR still wasn't online. Jared looked up at Tarbell, then back at his laptop. The battery indicator was now at 20%. "Give me a chance to chat with him," Jared said. Tarbell typed an email to the group, his palms sweaty. "Has not signed in yet," he wrote, and then noted that the undercover agent on the Silk Road, Jared, would need to lure Dread Pirate Roberts into the site's marketplace, ensuring he was caught with digital drugs and virtual money in his hand. If they didn't get him with his laptop open and logged into the site, and Ross managed to close the lid before a key or press a key that encrypted the hard drive, the case could go poof. Finally, Tarbell reminded everyone that when he gave the go-ahead, pull the laptop away, then get arrest. When Jared saw Dread appear in his chat window, the thought popped into his head was, oh fuck, this is it. Any adrenaline that had been pumping through him in that moment earlier went quiet as he focused on the task in front of him. Everything, he realized, came down to this very moment. An envoy of FBI agents was racing up the freeway. Tarbell stood nearby watching traffic, and agents from DEA, HSI, CBP, DOJ, IRS, ATF, and U.S. Attorney's Office, as well as the senators, governors, and even the President of the United States, were waiting to hear that this moment had happened without a hitch. Jared began typing into the Silk Road chat window on his computer. "Hey," he wrote, but there was no reply. A minute went by and Jared typed, "Hey," again. This time, though, he had a request for DPR. "Can you check out one of the flagged messages for me?" Jared knew that asking him would prompt DPR to log into the administrator's section of the site. And if the man now sitting at the library 100 feet away was really Dread Pirate Roberts, that same man would be logged into that section of the site if they grabbed the laptop. After what felt like an eternity, a ding finally sounded from Jared's computer as a reply appeared on the screen. Quote, "Sure," DPR wrote, "let me log in," and then followed up with a strange question. Quote, "You did Bitcoin exchange before you worked for me," Dread wrote, "right?" For some reason, DPR was testing him. Jared's mind started to swirl with worry. Did DPR know something was up? Jared scanned his mind, trying to remember the right answer. 3:13 p.m. A young Asian woman wandered through the library, plucking books from shelves. After a while, she came around the corner of the stack, standing in front of the science fiction and romance section, and pulled up a chair at the round beige table where Ross sat. His backpad rested next to him. His laptop glowed as he typed away. He peered over at his computer screen and at the young woman. She had a fair complexion and was perusing the pile of books in front of her. She seemed safe enough, so Ross looked back at his laptop, his fingers methodically moving up and down the keyboard as he typed. 3:14 p.m. Jared thought, trying to remember what the woman from Texas had told him in August when he had taken over her account. Had she done Bitcoin exchange, or has she not? He took a deep breath and took a chance replying, quote, yes, but just for a little bit. Not any more than that, DPR replied, still fishing for an answer. A test indeed. No, Jared wrote back. I stopped because of reporting requirements. What he said must have worked because Dredd soon asked, okay, which post? He was now definitely logged in to all three administrative areas in the Silk Road. Jared looked at Tarbell and began swirling his finger in the air like a helicopter about to take flight. Go, 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 he said swiftly. Go. Tarbell's thumb hammered down on his phone as he typed as fast as he could. He's logged in, he wrote fully, and followed by pull laptop, go. He scrambled across the street and into the library. Jared came running up behind Tarbell. It was pure adrenaline now. They both hurried up into the library steps until Tarbell came to a swift standstill mid-stride and swung his arm out to stop Jared. Let them do their thing, Tarbell whispered. For 10 seconds, Jared and Tarbell didn't say a word. They stood there, frozen, on the concrete steps of the library, and they heard it, the yelling and commotion that had just erupted inside the quiet library on Diamond Street. 3:15 p.m. 1 minute, the library was silent. The next, the Asian woman yelled, "Fuck you," at a man standing next to her. Everyone in the library looked up, startled by the outburst. The man who had just been told to go fuck himself raised his fist to seemingly punch the woman in the face. As his clenched hand went up into the air, a startled Ross Ulbricht turned around in his chair to witness the commotion. And just in that moment, as Jared and Tarbell stood at the base of the stairs, the Asian woman with the fair complexion who had been seated at the table across from Ross reached over and gently slid the Samsung laptop away from him. Ross turned back, half comprehending what was going on as he tried to lunge for the laptop. Yet he couldn't. Someone had grabbed his arms from behind. FBI, FBI. The couple who had just been yelling at each other now bellowed at Ross as they slammed him against the table. Brophy rushed over, slapped handcuffs around Ross's wrist, and retrieved him. Tom, visibly shaken by the intensity of the moment, came to retrieve the laptop, which was still wide open and, thanks to Jared, also logged in to all three administrative areas of the Silk Road, including the mastermind page, an area of the site only Dread Pirate Roberts and Ross Albrecht could log into. As Tarbell and Jared entered the second floor of the library, Brophy appeared holding by the arm of a young man who was now handcuffed and had panic in his face. This is going to be your new best friend, Brophy said to Tarbell and Jared as he handed Ross Albrecht over to them. Inside the library, patrons started to yell at Brophy and the others. What did the kid do? They hollered, leave him alone. To them, it was just a young man in handcuffs who'd been minding his own business, just using his laptop. Tarbell and Jared led Ross down the concrete steps out to the street. Tarbell turned to Ross and gently patted up against the wall, and he began patting him down. In Ross's pockets, there were only two $1 bills, spare change, and a set of house keys. So, wow, that is absolutely insane. The absolute minute-by-minute breakdown of the arrest of Ross Ulbricht from literally a day away of the FBI swatting him, coming in, possibly absolutely fucking up the entire case, to somehow getting so lucky that Ross Ulbricht would go out of his house the day before the SWAT, go to a public library, log into absolutely every administrative section in the Silk Road, especially the mastermind, which only DPR had access to, and they caught him that way. Like, that is absolutely insane to me. Like, reading that section the first time, I mean, oh my goodness. I hope I did it justice by reading it word for word. I hope I wasn't that bad. I hope you guys were in the moment and actually felt it as if like you were there, because that's definitely how I felt when I read it for the first time. Wow. So after the dramatic takedown in the San Francisco library, while Ross with his finger still on the keyboard, the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because now it was time for the trial. Ross Ulbricht, the quiet, nerdy kid from Texas, the idealistic libertarian who wanted to create a free marketplace online, was now on trial for a $1.2 billion criminal empire. And the evidence? Let's just say the FBI struck gold with this entire thing. The Samsung laptop they snatched off his lap, it was stuffed with everything. Chat logs from his top lieutenants like Variety Jones, Smedley, and yup, Knob himself. Financial spreadsheets, his personal journal where he literally documented each milestone of the site, even the hits that he had ordered, passwords, source codes, even server details. One password that was found on the computer's RAM was Purple Orange Beach, no spaces. Once inside, the feds made multiple backups, ate McDonald's, and spent 10 hours combing through every single byte and transferring it, making backups and backups of those backups. They didn't just have evidence, they literally had the blueprint of the entire operation. And when Ross was offered a plea deal of 10 years to life, he said no, because worst case scenario, I could get life. And so he thought maybe somehow he could beat this. But instead, the government decided that they would make an example of him. They threw everything at him: narcotic distribution via the internet, conspiracy to traffic drugs, computer hacking, money laundering, fake ID trafficking, and the big one, running a continuing criminal enterprise, also known as the Kingpin statute. The same one that they used on mafia bosses. That alone carried a mandatory 20-year sentence and could all go all the way to life. And while he wasn't officially charged with murder, the judge made her thoughts very clear. Quote, saying, "Did you commission murders? 5, yes. Did you pay for them? Yes. Did you get photos back thinking they were dead? Yes. And even though nobody actually died, he was scammed on every single hit by the DEA and the Hells Angels. That didn't matter. The judge wasn't forgiving. And on May 29, 2015, she sentenced Ross Albrecht to 2 life sentences plus 40 years. No parole, no early releases. Ross is going to die in prison. And here's the interesting twist, as we know as a few months ago. While Ross was going down, the government started looking into some of their own agents, and they found some stuff. Carl Force, the DEA agent who pretended to be Knob, Kevin, and French maid, he had stolen 757,000, not essentially stolen, but been given by DPR himself in Bitcoin from the case, and tried to sell movie rights to his story. Because at first, when they arrested Ross Ulbricht, he wasn't found until years later when they started combing through all this stuff. And he thought he was in the clear. So he literally started buying lavish things, luxurious goods. And he even, because he thought he got away with it, tried selling rights to his story for the movie. At first, he thought he got away with it. He even got an award from the DEA. But then someone found the message signed Carl instead of French Maid. And then the rest unraveled from there. Carl eventually pled guilty and went to prison. Then came Sean Bridges, the Secret Service agent who had stolen over $820,000 in Bitcoin from Curtis Green's account. Obviously, initially that $350,000, but he was also still doing his own little backup work in it too. He tried to wipe his laptop, change his name, and even tried to flee the country. It didn't work out. He got 71 months in prison. And for Curtis Green, the guy who was fake assassinated, the Silk Road employee who got waterboarded in the hotel tub, he actually walked free because the judge acknowledged that 2 federal agents had broken the law while investigating him. So Curtis, who once faced up to 40 years in prison, got time served. Afterward, he actually wrote and started selling Silk Road memorabilia, t-shirts, hats, and even signed copies of his memoir, which he's still writing now. Now, after Ross Ulbricht was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 40 years with no parole, most people assumed the story was over from there. But one person never stopped fighting for Ross, and it was his mother, Lynn Albrecht. She became the face, the voice, and the engine behind one of the most determined criminal justice reform efforts in recent memory. She quit her job, sold her house, and dedicated every waking hour to freeing her son. She read court transcripts, pored over legal documents, and met with lawyers, politicians, and journalists, anybody who would listen. She even built a movement from scratch. She launched the website freeross.org, started a petition, and traveled the country speaking at events, from crypto conferences to libertarian rallies, telling her story of a young man sentenced to die in prison for simply building a website. And the movement caught on. The Free Ross petition gathered over 600,000 signatures. Over 250 organizations, public figures, and leaders signed letters calling for clemency, including presidential candidates, legal scholars, privacy advocates, and blockchain pioneers. Social media lit it up with the support, not just from crypto fans, but from people who saw Ross's sentence as a symbol of a broken justice system, because they were trying to make Ross an example. Um, a little bit of, and this is really interesting. Ross creating the website, obviously, he did a lot of bad things. Essentially, he just created the marketplace. He never really did anything wrong. I mean, he did. This is a really weird, nuanced thing. Like, it's a very interesting thing. Essentially, he never got anyone killed. Yes, he did hire them for hitmen, but he never got anyone killed. He essentially did just open up the marketplace. He was never actually selling things. He was just making a commission off it. And yet he gets basically 2 life sentences in 40 years. And then Carl Force and Sean Bridges, the guys who were stealing, only got 70 months. Like, make that make sense. So I definitely see why people thought that Ross's sentence was a little too aggressive. But again, they were trying to make an example out of him. And so year after year, Lynn pushed forward. She met with lawmakers. She pleaded with presidents. She even tried to get Ross's case to the Supreme Court, but they declined to hear it. Still, she never gave up. And then finally, in January 2025, her efforts paid off, because on January 1st of 2025, President Donald Trump granted Ross Ulbricht a full and unconditional pardon. Trump announced that the decision himself on Truth Social, saying, quote, "I just called the mother of Ross William Albrecht, to let her know that in honor of her and the Libertarian movement, which supported me so strongly, it was my pleasure to just have signed a full and unconditional pardon of Ross Albrecht." After 11 years in prison, Ross walked free. The man who once ran the Silk Road, the dark web's most notorious marketplace, was now standing beside his mother, hugging her outside the prison gates. And if there's one reason why that happened, it wasn't politics, it wasn't Bitcoin, it wasn't lobbying. It was a mother who refused to let the system swallow her son whole. And because while Ross Ulbricht created the Silk Road, it was Lynn Albrecht who built the movement that brought him home. So, what do we make of this story? Ross Ulbricht, the kid from Texas who just wanted to explore ideas and push boundaries of freedom, who went from fumbling business ventures and living in basements to building one of the most profitable, most notorious black markets in internet history. And now I'm not here to tell you that he's a saint, and I'm not here to call him evil either. That's your call to make after hearing this story. Because the truth is, both sides exist in this story. Ross started Silk Road with a vision built on libertarian ideas, personal freedom, and voluntary exchange. But somewhere along the way, ideas turned into ego and philosophy turned into paranoia. And a man who once debated non-aggression and free markets ended up ordering hits on his own employees. And yeah, it's wild to see him walk free now. I mean, after everything we know, after the hits, the manipulation, the power trip, it's pretty incredible. And honestly, it's a little unnerving at the same time, because let's be real. You saw how unstable Ross became at the end when he really started to go from Ross to Dread Pirate Roberts. I mean, you saw how quickly he went from writing code to essentially playing God. So yeah, his release is a little hard to celebrate, in my honest opinion. But maybe that's what makes the story so compelling. It's not simple. It's not clean. Maybe it's not supposed to be. It's a cautionary tale. It's about what happens when brilliance meets obsession, and when you're involved in the world of what Ross Ulbricht was involved in, and when freedom collides with control, when a dream gets so big that it outgrows the person who built it. And if there's one takeaway I keep coming back to, it's this: it's just how fast your life can change. 1 month, you're scraping by on failed ideas. And then the next, you're running an empire staring down at the FBI and logging chat logs like you're Tony Soprano. What you built, intentionally or not, can take on a life of its own. And once it does, you might not be the one steering it anymore. Some so whether you see Ross Ulbricht as a visionary, criminal, or something maybe in between, there's no denying that he changed the internet forever. I mean, he changed himself in the process as well, from Ross to Dread Pirate Roberts to inmate 18870-111 to now a free man. And somewhere in that transformation is a lesson that I think we all need to wrestle with, because sometimes the people who want to change the world actually do. They just have no idea what it'll cost.